In the quiet hush before dawn, a solitary slipper lay abandoned in the palace garden, its silk damp with night dew, as if a small foot had slipped away into the unseen. Those who passed felt a shiver, sensing the lingering trace of a princess whose life had drifted beyond the reach of memory on that silent, unforgiving autumn morning. Welcome, dear listener. Share when and where you join this quiet circle of memory, connecting us across the world. If you wish to support the channel, please subscribe now gently. The door that had slid open in the dimness still lingered in the mind, its faint wooden sigh carrying forward into this first wandering of the story, as though inviting us to step quietly across the threshold of a world that was already fading when Princess Deokhye first drew breath. The final decades of the Joseon court unfolded not with the grandeur of a dynasty at its height, but with the soft, weary rustle of a kingdom struggling to breathe beneath the growing weight of a foreign empire. The palace grounds, once alive with confident footsteps and the murmured commands of officials, had become a place of muted voices and measured gazes. Even the stone pathways seemed to cool more quickly in the evening air, as if the warmth of the nation's spirit slipped away day by day. Attendants walked softly, careful not to let their emotions echo in the open corridors. The court ladies still carried themselves with grace, their hanbok skirts brushing the polished floors like gentle tides, yet beneath their practiced serenity was an unease they dared not name. Outside the palace walls, the world was tightening, but inside, it felt as though time itself had begun to hold its breath. The late reign of Emperor Gojong was marked not by command but by constraint, and every decision made beneath his roof came shadowed by watchful eyes from beyond the sea. Notices from Japanese officials arrived more frequently, wrapped in formal language, yet containing an unmistakable tone of inevitability. The court knew, though none dared speak it aloud, that its authority had become more symbol than substance. The palaces, once the heart of governance and tradition, now felt like lanterns dimmed under an encroaching storm. A strange quietness filled the air, not the peaceful kind that blesses a still night, but the quiet that grows when people fear that even their whispers might be overheard. It was during these uneasy days that the royal household found itself holding onto old rituals with heightened devotion, as though preserving them might somehow restore a crumbling world. In the cool courtyards, where sunlight once shimmered across ornate rooftops, shadows stretched longer than before. The wind carried hints of distant footsteps that did not belong to palace guards, but to men in foreign uniforms who patrolled with an authority that felt heavier each season. The ministers who used to stand tall now bowed more deeply, both to the emperor and to those whom they did not wish to acknowledge as masters. And yet, amid this uneasy landscape, life within the palace continued, as life often does even in the presence of endings. The birds still gathered on the high eaves in the morning, chirping their small defiance against the tightening grip around the kingdom. The court musicians still practiced melodies that descended from centuries past, though the notes trembled now, as if aware they might be among the last to echo through the palace halls. It was in such a moment of tension and fragility that the story of the last princess quietly began to take shape, even before she was born. But for now, the palace waited. It waited in breathless uncertainty, sensing something soon to unfold but unsure whether it would bring hope or deepen despair. Some courtiers believed that the birth of a royal child might become a symbolic turning point, a spark of renewal in a lineage that felt itself slipping toward the horizon. Others feared that no matter how beloved the infant, the threads of fate had already twisted beyond the reach of any single life. Still, there were those who dared hold on to gentle hope in secret places within their hearts, whispering prayers into the night air for a blessing that might soften the destiny of the royal family. Inside the queen's quarters, Incense drifted like soft trails of memory, and silk screens painted with mountains, and water reflected the quiet longing of the court. Midwives moved with steady hands, speaking softly so their words might not disturb the calm the queen sought to maintain. Even in such intimate chambers, there was an undercurrent of secrecy, as though the walls themselves had ears. Yet within this cocoon of measured voices and ritual care, there was a stirring of something delicate, something that the palace dared not wish for too boldly. Could a single child, born at the dusk of a dynasty, bring a moment of solace to those who feared the final extinguishing of their world? The air of late Joseon had a strange taste to it, like cold tea left too long on the table, still bearing the fragrance of its leaves, yet void of warmth. At times one might look at the palace and imagine the ghosts of past kings walking among its halls, observing the quiet erosion of authority with solemn acceptance. Perhaps they wondered how much sorrow the living generation must carry before yielding to the tides of history. And perhaps, too, they wondered whether the child soon to be born would inherit not a lineage of power, but a lineage of loss. Those who served closest to the royal family sensed this shifting of the ages in subtle details. The hesitation before an official seal was pressed onto a document, the deeper bow performed before emissaries, the long pauses in the emperor's speech when he gazed toward the mountains as though searching for an answer that would no longer come. When evening settled, a hush would fall over the palace rooftops, and the lanterns seemed to glow with a softened melancholy, their light flickering like uncertain memories. The night watchmen, loyal yet weary, walked their rounds with slower steps, listening to the distant hum of a changing world beyond the walls. And yet, in these moments of unease, the palace remained a sanctuary of sorts, holding within its old wooden beams the last remnants of dignity. The faint scent of pine resin still rose from the pillars. The sound of silk brushing across polished floors still echoed like a gentle lullaby. The moonlit ponds reflected the heavens with the same serene beauty they had shown for generations. These small continuities allowed those within the palace to pretend, if only briefly, that their traditions still held meaning, that their kingdom still stood firm. But deep inside, they knew. They knew that the dynasty was not merely fading, it was being unstitched, thread by hands that claimed to offer modernity, while binding the court ever tighter. The world outside no longer bowed toward the throne. The world outside carried trains, telegraphs, and treaties that shaped futures without asking the palace for permission. And yet, even as the realm slipped silently from the emperor's grasp, something gentle and fragile prepared to enter the world within those ancient walls. The sliding door that had sighed open at the end of our prelude seems now to widen a little further, letting in the cool morning air and the faint rustle of distant leaves. It is through that quiet doorway that we step toward the moment of her beginning, toward the child who would one day be known as the last princess of a fallen dynasty, though she herself could not yet sense the weight of time gathering around her. The fading ring of the palace bells lingered in the cool morning air, thinning like a distant memory as it opened the path into the next quiet stretch of her story. And it was within that pale echo that Princess Deokhye first entered the world. She was born in 1912 in a chamber softened by screens painted with plum blossoms, during a time when the Joseon court still insisted on performing its rituals with utmost precision, as if the careful preservation of old forms could shield them from the approaching tides. Those who attended her birth spoke in hushed tones, not merely out of respect, but out of a peculiar blend of hope and sorrow. For while every royal birth once signaled the continuation of a kingdom's line, this one arrived into a landscape where the lines had already begun to blur and break. The dynasty that had endured through 5 centuries found itself collapsing inward, its authority eroded by foreign intrusion and internal exhaustion, leaving this delicate child to emerge into a world that could offer her neither stability nor certainty. Yet within the palace walls, for a brief moment, her arrival brought a fragile brightness. Emperor Gojong, aging and wearied by years of political turmoil, saw in his newborn daughter a flicker of warmth he had not felt in long seasons. Though she was born of a concubine and therefore not initially positioned with the same prominence as children of the queen, the emperor's affection for her was unmistakable. Palace attendants noticed the way his expression softened when he approached her crib, the way he paused as though memorizing the gentle rise and fall of her breath. Some whispered that he cherished her differently, perhaps because she was born so late in his life, perhaps because in her he saw not the weight of expectation, but a small reminder that innocence still existed somewhere within the palace's shadowed halls. If the empire itself was slipping beyond his reach, then perhaps he could still hold close this child who carried a softness untouched by politics. But even in these early days, uncertainty threaded through her life like a faint crack beneath polished lacquer. The infant princess suffered from fragile health, prone to fevers and long spells of weakness that kept the court in quiet worry. Attendants prepared her baths with purified water, wrapped her in the softest cotton, and whispered old palace prayers for her strength to return. There were days when she seemed unable to lift her head, days when her small cries barely broke the silence, and the royal household gathered in concern. Yet there were also moments when she opened her eyes with surprising clarity, gazing at the patterns on the wooden ceiling as though her unspoken thoughts wandered far beyond the cradle that held her. Those closest to her later recalled that she carried a gentleness that seemed almost otherworldly, as if she sensed the tremors of the world around her even before she could understand them. As she grew through her early childhood, the palace shaped her days with routines born from centuries of tradition. She was taught to bow, to sit in the quiet posture befitting a child of the royal line, to hold the hem of her garment with a certain grace, though her small hands often trembled from illness. Court ladies hovered nearby, guiding her steps across polished floors, and when she tired, they carried her beneath the shade of old pines, where the wind hummed low melodies through the branches. From the outside, it might have appeared as though her life held serenity, but beneath the surface lay a tension that she absorbed without understanding. The palace itself felt divided between a world determined to preserve tradition and another forced to accept foreign mandates. Even a child could sense the subtle heaviness in the air, the way conversations stopped abruptly when Japanese officials visited, the way her elders' faces tightened whenever news arrived from outside the palace gates. Her father's affection offered her a small refuge. Emperor Gojong took comfort in her presence, often requesting that she be brought to him during his quieter hours. Those moments, her resting beside him as he read or contemplated state documents, created an image of tenderness rarely spoken of in grand histories. There were times when he traced a finger gently along her cheek or lifted her into his lap, observing the smallness of her hands against the embroidered fabric of his robe. These gestures, so simple yet profound, revealed a deeper truth. The emperor, surrounded by the turbulence of politics, clung to her as though she represented the last untouched piece of his world. But even as he loved her, he could not protect her from the empire's shifting fate. Decisions were being made in distant rooms, in foreign cities, and her life, though wrapped in silk, was already being shaped by unseen forces. Outside the palace, the Japanese occupation continued tightening its grip. Policies that undermined Korean sovereignty seeped into every corner of national life, and even the royal family was not exempt from the growing pressures. The court was monitored, its members subtly controlled, and the presence of a young princess, particularly one representing the last generation of the chosen line, held symbolic significance that the occupying power could not ignore. Yet she remained blissfully unaware of these complexities, toddling through sunlit courtyards, delighting in the flutter of birds, tracing patterns in the dirt with a twig. Her childhood was a tender interlude, suspended above an ever-widening chasm. Still, the elders of the palace could not help wondering about her future. Would she grow strong enough to withstand the illnesses that plagued her early years? Would she one day study the ancient texts as princesses before her had done? Or would she be swept up by the shifting political winds that seemed determined to reshape the fate of the entire royal family? These questions lingered in the mind of every court lady who dressed her, every tutor who observed her gentle manners, every attendant who carried her through gardens where autumn leaves fell like quiet omens. There were evenings when shadows deepened early and the palace seemed to retreat into itself. On those nights, the young princess sometimes woke, unsettled, and was soothed by attendants who told her soft stories about her ancestors, about wise kings and steadfast queens. They spoke of resilience, of grace in hardship, of the quiet strength that runs through a nation, even when its throne falters. Though she could not yet understand the weight of these tales, she listened with wide eyes, absorbing their cadences as naturally as breathing. In later years, some would wonder whether those stories reverberated within her during her most difficult moments, a faint echo of the heritage she cherished yet lost. By the time she reached her early childhood, her presence had become a cherished yet delicate thread in the palace's tapestry. Those who served her were careful in every step, aware that she represented both the last blossom of the dynasty and a soul whose path was destined to diverge from all who had come before her. The world outside grew louder, more insistent, but within the palace her small world moved at the rhythm of rustling leaves, the soft tapping of embroidered shoes on stone, and the faint calls of distant birds. And when the palace bells sounded once again, their tones trembling in the misty morning air, they seemed to carry both a blessing and a warning, as though whispering that this child, so loved, so fragile, would soon be drawn into a destiny neither she nor those around her could prevent. The distant chime faded slowly, leaving behind a quiet that seemed to wait for the next step in her unfolding journey. The last of the palace bells had scarcely faded before the soft quiet of the courtyard deepened, and in that hush, the unattended ink brush lay on the low writing table, its tip slowly drying into a stiff curl of black. That small detail lingered like an omen of what was beginning to unfold, for as Princess Deokhye grew from an ailing infant into a gentle child, the shadows around her also lengthened, carrying with them the certainty that her world, once enclosed in silk screens and ritual calm, was now being watched by forces far beyond the palace walls. In those years, Japan's presence in Joseon no longer moved quietly. Its officials walked through the streets with unchallenged authority, its schools replaced the old academies, and its decrees shaped the lives of both commoners and aristocrats alike. Inside the palace, attempts to maintain an illusion of sovereignty became increasingly strained, as though the court were an old tapestry whose threads were coming loose faster than they could be mended. Even a child as young as Deokhye, sheltered as she was, began to sense the strange heaviness that settled over the adults around her, their glances growing more cautious, their conversations halting abruptly whenever soft foreign footsteps sounded down the corridor. By the time she was old enough to walk steadily on her own, the princess noticed that unfamiliar men in crisp uniforms now appeared in places once reserved only for the royal household. They bowed politely, yet their eyes carried an authority that made even high-ranking court officials stiffen. Her caretakers kept her close, guiding her away from these visitors with quiet determination, though they never explained why. Children are more perceptive than adults often realize. Without understanding the political meaning, Deokhye felt the contrast between the warmth of her father's presence and the coldness of those watchful strangers. When she wandered too close to the main gates, she heard the clipped conversations of guards speaking in a language not her own. And though she did not grasp their words, she recognized the tone. the tone of men who believed they belonged there more than those who had lived within the palace for generations. What unsettled the court most was that Princess Deokhye, though still very young, had become a silent symbol of continuity for the Korean people. Her existence alone reminded them that the royal line still lived, that the past had not yet been erased. For the Japanese authorities, that symbolism was inconvenient, something to be managed carefully. They sought to incorporate the royal family into the imperial structure, to transform them into decorative figures, legitimizing Japanese rule. Deokhye represented a contradiction they could not ignore. Too young to wield power, yet too significant to leave entirely within the independent sphere of the old court. Her future, therefore, became a matter of political concern long before she could comprehend what politics even meant. Inside her private chambers, the world remained smaller, shaped by the hands of attentive court ladies who adored her. They dressed her in soft yellow robes embroidered with cranes. They combed her hair into neat knots. They placed warm rice cakes before her during celebrations. Yet even these intimate rituals carried hints of sorrow. Sometimes, when they believed she was not watching, the women exchanged glances filled with unspoken worry. A princess, born at the dusk of a dynasty, stood in a peculiar light, both treasured and vulnerable, both honored and exposed. They knew that the palace could no longer protect its own, that even a child might one day be taken away under the guise of modern education or political propriety. And so, the older attendants held her hands more gently, as though memorizing their warmth while it was still near. Princess Deokhye herself seemed to grow more contemplative with each passing year. Her fragile health still caused concern, but her mind often drifted with unusual sensitivity, as though the shifting currents of history left faint impressions upon her. She watched the palace gardens with quiet fascination, noticing subtleties others overlooked, the way morning light filtered differently through pines than through maples, the way dragonflies hovered as if listening to the wind's secrets. She delighted in simple wonders: falling petals, the crisp sound of footsteps on gravel, the soft clatter of teacups. But at times her face clouded with an expression beyond her years, as though she were trying to understand a change in the air that she could not yet name. Meanwhile, beyond the palace, public discontent simmered. Newspapers carried cautious articles hinting at the loss of sovereignty, only to be censored. Students whispered about resistance, markets buzzed with speculation, and all the while the royal family lived in a narrowing world where each decision required appeasing the foreign power that claimed to guide Korea toward modernity. Deokhye's father, Emperor Gojong, grew increasingly protective of his youngest daughter, perhaps sensing that she would face a fate unlike any of her predecessors. Yet even his affection could not fully shield her. Policies tightened. Reports circulated. Suggestions were made, first subtly, then more firmly, that the princess might one day benefit from a superior education abroad. These proposals, masked as gestures of goodwill, were understood clearly by the court. They signaled that Japan intended to remove her from the symbolic heart of Korea. The atmosphere within the palace changed accordingly. Tutors adjusted their lessons to include Japanese language and customs. Letters arrived that the emperor read with a furrowed brow. Advisors spoke in low tones about what was to be done, though none dared openly oppose the occupation's demands. At night, the lanterns seemed dimmer, their soft glow unable to warm the vast halls as they once had. Even the air felt different, less like the breath of a living kingdom and more like the remnants of a heritage slowly being sealed away. Still, life continued for the princess in small, familiar rhythms. She fed crumbs to sparrows at dawn. She played simple games with the children of palace attendants. She traced patterns on the floor with a curious finger as storytellers recounted tales of old queens who weathered hardship with grace. Yet even in these fragile moments of innocence, she felt the tension humming beneath daily life. There were days when she noticed servants speaking hurriedly before catching themselves, days when she saw her father staring into the distance with a heaviness he tried to conceal. And though no one explained the shifting reality, she sensed that something beyond her control was approaching, drawing nearer like a shadow lengthening in the late afternoon sun. In the end, it was not a single event, but a slow accumulation of subtle shifts that marked the turning point of her early years. The palace became quieter. The gates stood under stricter guard. Announcements from Japanese authorities arrived with increasing frequency, and the princess, still too young to grasp the meaning, felt her world grow smaller even as the eyes of the empire pressed closer. It was in this fragile, complex moment, when the old world had not yet ended but was already unraveling, that the ink brush left unattended began to dry, its dark tip curling inward like the first sign of something precious slipping beyond reach. And as that ink brush stiffened, its silent transformation marked the beginning of the next phase of her life, a phase where innocence would meet the unyielding machinery of occupation, and the gentle world of her childhood would begin to fold away piece by piece, like paper screens being silently removed in the night. The trembling of the ship's deck lingered in the mind, as though the wood itself remembered the moment her small feet touched its surface for the first time. And from that quiver, the next chapter of her life unfolded, carrying her away from the world that had shaped her earliest breaths. The decision had been announced not with discussion, not with the gentle words that guide a child into understanding, but with formal declarations presented to the royal household as if the matter were already sealed by forces far beyond the palace gates. Princess Deokhye, barely into her adolescence, was to be sent to Japan for an education deemed essential by the occupying authorities. They spoke of opportunity, of refinement, of modern learning, yet behind every polite phrase lay an unmistakable truth. This was not a choice, but a quiet removal. Those within the palace understood the intention clearly enough. By taking the last princess and placing her under the guardianship of the empire, Japan could reshape not only her upbringing, but the destiny of the royal line itself. And so, without fanfare, preparations began, each step cutting another thread that bound her to her homeland. In the weeks before her departure, the palace felt caught between haste and denial. Her caretakers continued their routines with meticulous devotion, brushing her hair in long, gentle strokes, folding her garments with deliberation, guiding her through familiar courtyards where the wind carried the scent of pine and autumn leaves. Yet beneath their practiced composure lay a trembling sorrow. How does one prepare a child to leave without telling her the full weight of what she is leaving behind? Some attendants pressed her hands a little longer than necessary, their touch lingering as though they feared she might slip away like a dream if they let go too soon. Others quietly placed keepsakes among her belongings, a small wooden toy, a pouch of dried herbs meant to comfort her during sleepless nights, a strip of silk embroidered with protective symbols, tokens of affection they hoped would follow her into the unknown. But the princess herself was given only softened explanations, words that framed the journey as a chance to broaden her horizons, to grow into the grace expected of her lineage. No one dared tell her that the corridors she walked daily, the pools where carp glided under lotus shadows, the old trees that swayed like guardians above her, might never again be part of her life. Her father, Emperor Gojong, aged and burdened, struggled with the decision in ways he could not express. The loss of sovereignty still weighed heavily on him, and now he faced the prospect of losing his daughter not to illness or danger, but to politics disguised as benevolence. Historical accounts often describe him as resigned, but those closest to the family later remembered moments when his grief surfaced quietly. The way he lingered by her sleeping form longer than usual, the way he touched her hair as if memorizing its softness, the way he looked out toward the palace gates with an expression that held both fury and helplessness. There were nights when he summoned her simply to sit beside him, saying little yet absorbing her presence, like a balm against the encroaching emptiness. To love someone in a time of powerlessness is to feel that love pulled taut, stretched across distances that cannot yet be seen. And then the morning arrived, the morning clouded with low mist that clung to the palace walls as though reluctant to let her go. She was dressed with great care in garments chosen to honor her status, though the weight of the layers made her movements slower and more solemn. Her caretakers walked with her through the halls, each step echoing louder than usual, as if the palace were listening. Even the servants who usually bowed with disciplined grace seemed softened by emotion, their gazes following her with a tenderness tinged by mourning. Outside the main gate, a carriage awaited to take her to the port, its wheels gleaming with polished restraint. The sight of it startled her slightly, for she had rarely traveled beyond the palace grounds. She clutched the small pouch one of the court ladies had placed in her hand earlier, feeling the texture of the embroidered silk beneath her fingers, and turned for a final glance at the palace, the only world she had ever known. At the port, the air smelled of salt and rust, carrying the cries of gulls that circled restlessly overhead. The ship that waited for her was vast compared to anything she had seen, its hull dark against the morning light. It loomed as though it were not merely a vessel, but a boundary she must cross, one that would sever her from the soil of her homeland more effectively than any political decree. The princess hesitated at the foot of the gangway, her heart pounding in the unfamiliar clamor of sailors, officials, and onlookers. Someone guided her forward gently, offering a reassuring smile she could not fully trust, and she stepped onto the wooden planks that shivered beneath her. That tremor, faint yet unmistakable, marked the first moment when she could feel the world shifting beneath her feet. Inside the ship, the cabins were tidy, clean, arranged with efficiency rather than comfort. She sat by the small window as the harbor began to recede, watching the shoreline blur into pale outlines. The water churned with quiet persistence, carrying her farther from the land whose mountains once shaped the horizon of every memory she possessed. Some accounts suggest that she cried that day, not loudly but quietly, with the restrained sorrow of a child who knows she should be brave, yet cannot comprehend why bravery is necessary. Others claimed she simply stared, her expression serene, in a way that unsettled even the officials accompanying her. Perhaps both are true, for a child is rarely one thing. Her heart may have been breaking silently, even as her face remained still. As the coastline disappeared entirely, a peculiar silence settled around her. The world outside the window no longer resembled anything she knew. The constant undulation of the sea, the vastness of the sky, the strange absence of familiar mountains, the sound of the waves, steady and indifferent, seemed to erase the voices of the palace, the hushed footsteps of her attendants, the distant chiming of the bells. In that in-between space, surrounded by nothing but water and sky, the princess became suspended between two identities, the child of a fading kingdom and the figure Japan intended to reshape. She could not realize it then, but the journey across the waters marked the beginning of her slow transformation into an exile, though she would not recognize the word for many years. Night aboard the ship brought a different kind of quiet. Lanterns swayed with the movement of the vessel, casting shifting patterns of light on the walls of her cabin. The wooden beams creaked softly, and the distant murmur of the engines hummed through the floors. She lay awake, listening, her small body rising and falling with the rhythm of the waves. It was in those hours, when both homeland and destination were distant, that she might have sensed the true weight of her journey. Not through comprehension, but through the deep, instinctive understanding that something precious had been left behind. The stars outside her window glittered coldly, and she wondered, perhaps only vaguely, whether the same stars shone above the palace at that moment, and whether anyone there looked up and thought of her. The ship sailed on, cutting a path across waters that had carried envoys, armies, merchants, exiles, and prisoners for centuries. Yet for this child, the voyage was singular and irreversible. By the time the shoreline of Japan emerged on the horizon, faint beneath a pale morning sky, her fate had already shifted. The world she would step into bore no resemblance to the one she had left, and though she did not yet understand the scale of the change, the journey had already imprinted itself upon her heart, leaving a delicate, indelible fracture. And when the ship finally slowed, its deck trembling once more beneath her feet, the trembling felt different. No longer the shiver of departure, but the quiet, unavoidable acknowledgement that she was arriving in a land where her life would be remade in ways she could not yet imagine. The trembling of the ship that had carried her across the strait still echoed faintly within her bones when she first stepped onto the unfamiliar soil, and it was through that same faint shiver that her new life in Japan slowly unfolded. Not with the excitement one might associate with travel, but with a quiet, disorienting sense of displacement. Princess Deokhye, accustomed to the muted elegance of Changdeokgung and the specific rhythm of palace life, found herself immersed in an environment that felt both meticulously ordered and profoundly foreign. There were no courtyards where pine needles carpeted the earth in soft whispers, no carved wooden verandas where the shadows of ancient rafters sheltered her from the sun. Here the buildings seemed sharper, the air denser, the language surrounding her a constant reminder of her position as a guest who was not truly a guest, a figure welcomed but not embraced. The officials assigned to oversee her education treated her with a politeness that retained a quiet stiffness, as though she were both an honored charge and a delicate artifact to be handled according to strict protocol. In the early days of her arrival, the princess tried to maintain the composure expected of her upbringing. She listened attentively during lessons, nodded politely when introduced to instructors, and carried herself with the grace instilled by years of ritual discipline. Yet beneath her stillness lay the unmistakable hum of uncertainty. The Japanese language, though not wholly unfamiliar thanks to her lessons in Korea, surrounded her now with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously observed and unseen. Classmates approached her with curiosity, their gestures friendly yet cautious, for they too sensed the strange aura surrounding the Korean princess placed among them. In their eyes, she was both a symbol and an anomaly, an emblem of a kingdom folded into their empire, a girl whose presence carried layers of history they did not fully understand. This strange duality left her suspended between worlds, belonging entirely to neither. Her residence in Japan was arranged with care but lacked the warmth of home. The rooms were immaculate, filled with pale light that filtered through shoji screens, illuminating spaces that felt more like stages than living quarters. Attendants assigned to her spoke softly, efficient in their duties yet distant in their demeanor. For a child already prone to quiet reflection, the subtle isolation pressed upon her more heavily than anyone around her realized. At night, she sometimes sat near the window, gazing out at a landscape that held no familiar contours, its mountains shaped differently, its streets lined with sounds and movements that did not echo the rhythms of her memory. She missed the texture of her mother's voice, the distinct creak of the palace floors, the hum of Korean wind slipping through the eaves of old buildings. Here, the wind felt sharper, and the silence that followed the day's activities carried a particular strain that made her chest tighten with homesickness. Her schooling demanded discipline, structure, and adaptation. Japan valued education deeply, and she was expected to excel not merely as a student, but as a representative of her heritage. Teachers corrected her with gentleness, yet firmness, reminding her that she must keep pace, that she must learn to navigate this world with the same precision she had been taught to show in court etiquette. Over time, she learned to read the subtle moods of her instructors, to mirror the calm mannerisms of her peers, to adjust her speech until it bore the controlled cadence expected of a young lady of status. But even as she adapted, something within her seemed to dim gradually, as though a soft light were being shaded by layers of unfamiliar customs, expectations, and quiet pressures she had never known before. Her loneliness deepened, not through overt mistreatment, but through the accumulation of small, piercing absences. She had no one with whom she could speak her native language freely, no one who understood the particularities of her upbringing, no one who recognized the weight she carried simply by being who she was. Each letter she attempted to write home trembled with unsaid thoughts, her confined emotions slipping into polite phrases that concealed more than they revealed. The officials overseeing her journey read the letters before sending them, sometimes altering, sometimes withholding, always ensuring the tone aligned with their preferred narrative. Whether she sensed this intrusion is difficult to say, but her later writings suggest a growing awareness that even her words were no longer wholly her own. There were days, perhaps, when she attempted to embrace her new environment with cautious sincerity. She observed the cherry blossoms blooming with such delicate beauty that they momentarily eased her sadness. She tasted unfamiliar dishes with polite curiosity. She learned to fold origami cranes, to bow with Japanese formality, to recite poems written in a language that was not born in her breath. Yet beneath every new experience lay the quiet ache of displacement, for beauty encountered in exile can never be fully separated from the ache of what has been left behind. Even the cherry blossoms, which she found enchanting, later came to symbolize transience in a way that felt too close to her own life, too reflective of a fragility she had not chosen. Her caretakers, though dutiful, rarely offered emotional reassurance. Their roles required neutrality, and neutrality can feel colder than distance. So the princess's inner world became a space where she carried both her memories and her uncertainties, a private refuge in which she preserved fragments of the palace life she feared she might forget. On some evenings, she hummed melodies taught to her in Korea, the notes trembling as though unsure of their place in this new land. At times, she traced patterns on paper, recalling the ink strokes of Korean calligraphy, though her brushes here felt different, their texture foreign beneath her fingers. These small acts, quiet and unobserved, served as anchors against the tide of unfamiliarity. As months turned into years, the pressures of representation intensified. The Japanese authorities wished for her to appear integrated, even content, for her presence served their narrative, the harmonious assimilation of Korea's royal heritage into the Japanese imperial structure. Photographs were taken of her in school settings, smiling faintly, seated beside Japanese classmates, attending ceremonies with dutiful poise. To the outside world, these images projected ease, acceptance, even privilege. But images, like history, often conceal more than they reveal. Behind the carefully arranged scenes lay a young girl navigating a life curated by political intention rather than personal choice. Yet Deokhye did not resist openly. Her nature, gentle and introspective, inclined her toward compliance rather than confrontation. She learned to survive quietly, to adapt without surrendering the core of who she was. Even in her silence, she carried an inner resilience, though it expressed itself not through rebellion, but through endurance. There were moments when she felt the weight of being watched, evaluated and assessed, not just as a student, but as a symbol. But she bore it with a dignity shaped by generations of royal discipline. Still, one cannot live indefinitely between identities without feeling the subtle pull of fracture. The longer she remained in Japan, the more she sensed herself drifting into a space where her past and present coexisted, but did not fully align. She was expected to become part of a culture that demanded loyalty. Yet her heart remained tethered to the land whose mountains and stories had shaped her earliest understanding of the world. This divide, still manageable in her youth, would widen in the years to come, becoming a quiet crack that later events would deepen into something far more devastating. And so her life in Japan continued, steady on the surface, yet shadowed underneath, each day carrying her a little farther from the palace she once called home, each night leaving her with the soft ache of memories she could not yet name as longing. The quiver of the ship's deck, the trembling that marked her crossing, lingered faintly still, a reminder of the moment her life had been gently removed from its rightful course and set upon a path shaped by forces indifferent to the heart of a young princess. The half-written letter she had once left unsent lingered in the quiet of her memory, its unfinished words curling like faint breath on cold paper. And from that stillness, the next chapter of her life slowly emerged, marked not by youthful choice or gentle promise, but by arrangements decided in distant rooms where her own voice was neither present nor required. As Princess Deokhye approached young adulthood, the pressures that had gathered around her since childhood began to concentrate into a single path, one scripted by political necessity rather than personal desire. The Japanese authorities, ever watchful, weighed her symbolic value with careful calculation. A princess of a fallen dynasty could not be left unattached, nor could she be permitted to return to a homeland where her presence might stir sentiments the empire preferred to keep dormant. And so, under the formal guise of duty and propriety, they arranged her marriage to a Japanese aristocrat, a union framed as an honor but understood by many, especially by those who knew her history, as another quiet step in the slow erasure of her identity. She was still young, too young, some whispered, to be given away into a life she had not imagined, too gentle to question decisions that arrived with ceremonial finality. The marriage was presented to her as something expected, something beneficial, something that aligned with the future envisioned for her by those who governed her existence. She was told of her fiancé's lineage, of his respectable position, of the stability such a union would provide. Yet what does lineage mean to a young woman who has spent her formative years as both guest and captive in a foreign land? What does stability offer the heart that quietly longs for a home she has not seen in years? The princess listened with polite stillness, nodding in the controlled manner she had been taught, but inside her, a quiet ache formed, the kind that deepens not through suffering, but through the gradual extinguishing of choices one never had the chance to make. The preparations for the marriage proceeded with careful formality. Tailors fitted her garments, jewelers measured her slender fingers, attendants rehearsed the sequence of gestures she would perform during the ceremonies. Each step felt strangely detached, as though she were watching her own life unfold from a distance, observing a version of herself being molded into a role she had not sought. The rooms where she prepared were filled with the scent of polished wood and new silk, yet these luxurious textures could not mask the heaviness settling around her. At night, when the house was quiet, she sometimes stared at the garments laid out for the ceremony, their elegant folds carrying a weight she struggled to name. The silk shimmered softly in the lamplight, beautiful yet unyielding, much like the expectations woven into her life. In those hours, she traced the embroidery with her fingertips and wondered, in the private corners of her mind, whether her mother would have approved, whether her father would have simply bowed his head in resignation or tried to offer some comfort across the distance that now separated them. Her court upbringing had taught her to endure sorrow quietly, to present serenity even when her heart trembled. And so, on the day of her wedding, she moved through the rituals with the slow, measured grace befitting her status. She bowed when required, smiled faintly when prompted, and allowed herself to be led through the motions as though she were a figure carved from ivory, rather than a young woman of flesh and conflicted emotions. Her husband, Tsuneori So, stood beside her with formal dignity. He was courteous, respectful, and attentive in a restrained manner, yet no amount of courtesy could bridge the quiet gulf between two lives placed together by decree. He was not unkind, but neither did he truly understand the weight she carried, the years of exile, the loneliness embedded in her silence, the homeland whose absence shaped the rhythm of her breath. Their early days together unfolded with a polite stillness. The household she entered was comfortable, managed with discipline, and filled with the soft rustling of servants accustomed to predictable routines. She learned to navigate these routines with the same quiet adaptability she developed in school. She attended social gatherings when required, offered polite bows to visiting relatives, and smiled gently during formal dinners. Yet beneath her calm exterior, a deeper loneliness began to unfurl. The home she now lived in was not unwelcoming, but it lacked the threads of familiarity that bind a person to a place. Every sound, the clatter of porcelain, the distant call of birds, the footsteps in the corridor, felt unfamiliar, and each unfamiliarity whispered to her the subtle truth that she was living someone else's life more than her own. Her husband's family maintained proper respect for her status, but did not treat her like a princess. To them, she was a noblewoman by marriage, not a symbol of a lost kingdom. Some members of the family viewed her with gentle curiosity, while others regarded her with a formality that rarely thawed into warmth. Deokhye herself rarely initiated conversation, speaking only when spoken to, her Korean accent marking her difference not in an endearing way, but in a quiet, persistent reminder of her otherness. There were moments when she sought solace in small domestic tasks, watering the garden, arranging flowers, practicing calligraphy in the quiet of the afternoon. These fragile acts of routine helped her gather the scattered fragments of her identity, even as the world around her pulled her in directions she did not choose. Her days were long, marked by a soft emptiness that deepened with the passing of each season. She missed the familiar rhythms of palace life, the steps of court ladies echoing in the corridors, the soft hum of ancestral rituals performed at dawn, the scent of pine resin rising from ancient pillars. Now, instead of the comforting patterns of her childhood, she moved through a world where every gesture seemed measured, every word filtered, every expression restrained. Even her wedding gifts, silk cushions, lacquered boxes, fine porcelain, felt less like offerings of celebration and more like symbols of a life she was expected to inhabit seamlessly. Though her husband showed kindness in small ways, a respectful distance when she seemed troubled, occasional attempts to draw her into conversation, there remained a hollow space between them, a space filled not with conflict, but with a mutual inability to reach one another's inner world. Their marriage was not a battlefield, but neither was it a sanctuary. It was an arrangement maintained with civility, sustained through routine, and shadowed by the quiet truth that affection cannot be legislated into existence. In the privacy of her room, she sometimes unfolded the memories of her homeland, like fragile garments stored too long in a chest. She recalled the palace gardens bathed in moonlight, the warmth of her father's hand, the soft dialect of the attendants who raised her. These memories, once a source of comfort, now pricked at her heart like thorns, for they reminded her not only of what she had lost, but of what she could no longer return to freely. Japan was the place where she lived, but Korea was the place where she existed. And in the long solitude of her married life, she felt the quiet distance between the two grow larger. There were nights when she could not sleep, when the house lay utterly still and the faintest creak of wood felt amplified in the darkness. During those hours, she sometimes wondered whether her presence in Japan truly mattered to anyone beyond the officials who had arranged her life. Was she merely a symbol, a name, an ornament placed carefully into the structure of empire? Or was she still, somewhere deep within, the princess who had once walked beneath the ancient trees of Changdeokgung, carrying the last breath of a fading dynasty? The half-written letter remained in her drawer, its unfinished words a quiet testament to the life she had left behind. And though she did not yet know it, this marriage, this carefully arranged union of courtesy and distance, would shape the next chapter of her journey, leading her toward both a fragile light and an unimaginable sorrow that would one day transform her existence entirely. The footsteps that had once receded into the empty corridor lingered in her memory like a faint aftersound. And from that quiet passage, the next chapter of Princess Deokhye's life slowly opened, revealing a rare and fragile light that briefly softened the long shadow of her exile. For amid the loneliness of a marriage arranged not by affection, but by policy, amid the slow erosion of the identity she had carried from her homeland, there emerged a moment of tenderness she had not dared to imagine. When her daughter, Macy, was born, the muted stillness of her days shifted, and the quiet rhythms of her life were rearranged around the small, delicate presence of the child who came into the world with a softness that reminded her, almost painfully, of the innocence she once possessed. It is said that when Deokhye first held her daughter, her hands trembled not from fear, but from an overwhelming sensation of wonder, as though she had been given something luminous and unexpected, a living thread binding her to a purpose beyond endurance. The house that once felt meticulously ordered and emotionally distant took on a different character with the infant's arrival. Soft cries echoed through its quiet rooms, breaking the polished silence that had settled like thick dust over her married life. Servants moved with new attentiveness, and even her husband's demeanor softened, though he maintained his characteristically reserved posture. Yet it was Deokhye whose world changed most profoundly. For the first time since leaving Korea, she felt a sense of belonging, not tied to place or duty, but to a small, warm body that depended on her entirely. She watched her daughter's eyelids flutter during sleep, traced the tiny wrinkles of her fingers, and pressed her cheek gently to the child's soft hair, inhaling the scent that felt like the first genuine comfort she had known in years. The bond formed quietly, not proclaimed but lived, natural as the rising of dawn. During those early months, Deokhye often held Masai against her chest while sitting near the window, where the light filtered softly through the shoji screens. In those tranquil moments, she would hum lullabies remembered from her own childhood, songs once whispered by the court ladies of Cheongdeokgung, notes that carried the cadence of her homeland. The melodies drifted through the air, mingling with the faint scent of tatami and the gentle rustle of the wind. She knew Masai would grow up hearing a language and culture different from her own, yet she hoped, perhaps quietly and without forming the thought into words, that some part of her Korean heritage might seep into her daughter's heart through the simple act of song. Every time she sang, she felt something ease within her, as though the distance between herself and the world she had left softened, just slightly. Her daughter's early years became a sanctuary for her, a space where she could place her affection freely, where no political intention overshadowed her expressions of tenderness. She found joy in the small milestones, the first smile, the tentative steps, the way Masai clung to her sleeve with instinctive trust. These moments became the anchor points of her days, steadying her in a world where she otherwise felt adrift. The coldness of her marriage, the constraints placed around her by Japanese authorities, the lingering sorrow of her separation from Korea, all these softened when she watched her daughter laugh or reach for her. For a time, her life felt warmed by a flame, too soft to illuminate her past, yet bright enough to soften her present. Yet even in these tender years, the fragility of her happiness revealed itself in subtle ways. As Masai grew older, her curiosity blossomed, and she became a child of her environment, speaking Japanese with ease, absorbing the customs of the household, responding naturally to the rhythms of the society in which she lived. At times, Deokhye felt a quiet pang when she realized that her daughter would never know the palace gardens of Changdeokgung, would never hear the morning bells echo across the old stone walls, would never see the gold crest of the phoenix shimmering under Korean sunlight. She felt this ache especially strongly whenever Masai pronounced a word in her clear, bright Japanese voice, or when relatives from her husband's side praised the child for her grace, attributing it to good upbringing rather than the royal bloodline that flowed through her veins. She loved her daughter profoundly, yet she also feared something she could not name, the fear that the child who filled her life with warmth would one day drift beyond her reach, shaped entirely by a world that had never been hers. She sometimes tried to teach Masai small Korean phrases, guiding the child's soft lips to form the sounds of her mother's language. Masai repeated them happily, unaware of their significance, her laughter ringing through the room like tiny bells. But the next day she would forget the words entirely, her young mind naturally returning to the language she heard around her. Each forgotten syllable felt like a gentle unraveling, a reminder of how the threads that tied her to her homeland remained unbearably thin. Still, these were subtle, melancholy notes, overshadowed by the larger joy her daughter brought. For several years, Deokhye's life found its rhythm in caring for Masai. She prepared small meals for her, carefully folding towels around her at bath time, brushing her hair into smooth strands while the child wriggled playfully. She sewed tiny garments with delicate patterns, her fingers moving with a tenderness she had rarely been able to express since her exile began. During those quiet afternoons, she felt herself almost returning to a sense of wholeness, as though motherhood offered her a small restoration of the agency she had long been denied. Her husband observed these moments from a respectful distance, occasionally offering his own gestures of paternal care, though always within the boundaries of his composed temperament. There were moments when Deokhye wondered whether their daughter might someday bridge the quiet gulf between them, yet the distance remained, subtle and persistent. What emerged instead was a household defined less by marital warmth and more by the shared presence of a child who unwittingly became the center of gravity around which both their lives revolved. But even the gentlest periods of her life carried an undercurrent of fragility, like the faint trembling one feels in the stillness before a storm. The political tension between Japan and Korea did not dissipate, it merely shifted shape. Though she had found a measure of peace in raising her daughter, she remained a princess of a fallen kingdom, and the Japanese authorities continued to observe her with interest. Reports about her activities were quietly filed away, restrictions on her movements lingered, and discussions about her future circulated behind closed doors. She was a mother, yes, but she was also a symbol, and symbols are rarely allowed to live freely. Her daughter, all innocence and brightness, remained unaware of the currents that swirled around her. Masai's laughter filled the house, her small hands clinging to her mother's with trust that felt like a fragile miracle. And Deokhye cherished every moment, sensing without understanding why that these years of gentle calm would become a cherished memory, not a permanent state. For now, though, the warmth of her daughter's presence remained her refuge, a soft glow illuminating a life marked by loss, offering her a grace she had not expected to receive in exile. The sound of her daughter's laughter, once bright and fluttering like a small bird taking flight, lingered in the air long after the child had grown. And from that fading echo, the next part of Princess Deokhye's story opened, though the light it carried quickly dimmed into a shadow so deep that even decades later, its outlines remain blurred by uncertainty, sorrow, and questions too painful to hold for long. For Masai, the child who had momentarily brightened the exiled princess's world entered adolescence with a gentleness reminiscent of her mother, but also with a subtle restlessness that often flickered across her quiet demeanor. In those years, Deokhye observed her daughter with a complex mixture of love and worry, sensing shifts that she could not fully interpret, yet fearing instinctively that something fragile was loosening in the child's spirit, something that could neither be contained through affection nor guided through the careful routines of their household. At times, she saw in Masai a wistful longing, the kind that reflected back upon her own early years, the longing of someone caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. There are accounts, fragmented, uncertain, pieced together from diaries and testimonies, suggesting that Masai experienced a growing sense of isolation in her youth, the kind of loneliness that forms quietly when a child carries within her a history she cannot articulate. Being the daughter of a Korean princess in Japan meant inheriting a story marked by two competing identities, yet accepted by neither. Though she spoke Japanese fluently, moved through society with the grace expected of a girl of her standing, and performed well in her studies, there were murmurs among her peers, subtle remarks that reminded her she was different. Some students viewed her with curiosity, others with silent distance. Her heritage, though something she had never chosen, became an invisible line that separated her from the seamless belonging she longed for. It is said that she sometimes asked her mother why their lives felt so different from those of other families. But Deokhye, bound by her own sorrow and the silence demanded by years of political suppression, struggled to answer. Mother and daughter grew close in quiet ways, sharing routines that softened the weight of their shared displacement. They took evening walks when the light dimmed and the streets quieted, the dusk offering a small illusion of privacy. They drank tea by the window, their reflections blending in the glass when rain streaked the city outside. Yet beneath these gentle rituals lay an unspoken tension, a sense that Masai was drifting inward, carrying thoughts she could not voice and uncertainties she could not resolve. Deokhye tried, in her tender way, to reach her, to create a haven within the confines of their controlled life. She caressed her daughter's hair, encouraged her studies, and whispered comforting words when the child seemed troubled. But sometimes, even the closest of bonds cannot bridge the gulf formed by the weight of identity, carried in silence. And then came the day, one that remains shrouded in mystery, when Masai vanished. The details of her disappearance have never been entirely clear, and perhaps that uncertainty is part of the sorrow that envelops this chapter of their lives. Some say she left of her own will, overwhelmed by pressures invisible to the outside world. Others suggest she may have been influenced by people whose motives remain unknown. A few accounts hint at a note, though what it may have contained has never been disclosed publicly. There are also whispers, the kind that grow in spaces where truth is constrained, that she may have sought an escape from the complexities of a life she felt she did not fully inhabit. Yet no one, neither historians nor family members, can say with certainty what led her to that moment of departure. What remains indisputable is the depth of the devastation her disappearance left behind. When the household realized that Masai was nowhere to be found, panic spread through the corridors like a sudden chill. Servants searched the rooms, calling her name with trembling voices. Her stepfather toiled through the streets with guarded urgency, questioning neighbors and acquaintances. But it was Princess Deokhye, whose world shattered in a way that would never be restored. She moved through the house like a figure trapped between waking and nightmare, her hands shaking as she clutched at objects that had once belonged to her daughter. A hair ribbon, a small notebook, a garment folded neatly in a drawer. She called Masai's name over and over, the sound thinning into a fragile whisper each time. Some accounts describe her sitting at the edge of her daughter's bed long into the night, repeating quiet prayers, or pressing her forehead to the pillow where the child had once slept, as though seeking warmth that had already faded. Investigations followed, but their progress was slow and clouded by the complexities of the era. The Japanese police made formal inquiries, but the political undercurrent that surrounded the princess's life meant that certain truths were difficult to access. And as days turned to weeks and weeks into months, the hope of finding Masai alive dwindled, though Deokye's heart refused to accept such a conclusion. She scoured every report, every rumor, every faint possibility, clinging to the thin threads of hope, even as her mind began to fracture under the unbearable strain. Witnesses from that period described the princess's decline with a soft sorrow, noting how her once composed demeanor slowly dissolved into confusion, tears, and moments of disorientation. The loss of her daughter was not merely the loss of a child, it was the loss of the only source of warmth that had sustained her through years of exile, the only presence that connected her to the future she had imagined. Without Masai, the delicate structure of her life collapsed, leaving her vulnerable to a tide of grief too powerful for her fragile spirit to withstand. She began experiencing hallucinations, speaking to her daughter as though she were still in the room, waking in the night convinced she had heard footsteps or laughter. There were days when she wandered the house in a daze, searching behind doors, calling out desperately into empty rooms. Her husband, unable to stem the torrent of her despair, sought medical intervention, which in that era often meant confinement rather than compassionate care. Thus began the slow descent into the mental collapse that would define the next decades of her life. The mystery of Masai's disappearance, whether escape, tragedy, or the result of pressures too great for a young woman to bear, remains one of the most heartbreaking, unanswered questions in the story of Korea's last princess. The silence surrounding it, both then and now, only deepens the sorrow. And Deokhye, who had endured exile, arranged marriage, and the gradual erasure of her identity with quiet endurance, found in this loss a grief too immense for even her gentle resilience to withstand. The empty space where her daughter once stood became the echo through which she wandered, again and again, until that echo blurred into the soft, trembling veil of madness that slowly closed around her life. The curtains at the open window still trembled faintly in her memory, as though stirred by the breath of a child who had only just slipped out of sight, and through that trembling, the next chapter of Princess Deokhye's life descended, not softly but with a slow, crushing weight that pressed upon her mind until the familiar contours of her world dissolved into fragments too scattered to gather again. In the days following Masai's disappearance, the princess clung to the thin strands of reason that remained to her, wandering from room to room with the unwavering conviction that her daughter must simply be hiding somewhere close, perhaps playing a prolonged game of silence, perhaps waiting to be found. The house seemed swollen with echoes. Every creak of wood, every rustle of cloth, every muffled step in the corridor became, for an instant, her daughter's presence returning. She called out Masai, her voice shifting from authoritative to pleading to barely breath. But the silence that greeted her each time hollowed her more deeply than she could bear. The corridors that had once felt stable beneath her steps now stretched impossibly long, and her hands trailed along the walls as though she needed to anchor herself to something solid as her own inner world began to slip. Her husband observed her with increasing worry, though he rarely intruded upon the rawness of her grief. He kept his distance in the way that had always defined their marriage, respectful, composed, yet unable to bridge the emotional gulf between them. At first, he attempted to comfort her, offering gentle reassurances that the authorities were doing everything possible to find the girl, that perhaps she had sought refuge with a friend or relative, that some clue would soon surface. But these words, spoken with cautious optimism, fell upon ears that had closed themselves to the reasoning of the world outside her anguish. Deokhye held tightly to the belief that her daughter was still just beyond reach, perhaps somewhere she had overlooked. She refused meals, refused sleep, refused to accept that time moved forward without bringing Masai back to her. The familiar routines of the household collapsed entirely around her as she lost the ability to participate in them, consumed instead by the singular mission of a mother searching for a child who had become both everywhere and nowhere. Soon her grief began to manifest in ways that frightened even those accustomed to her delicate temperament. She would wake before dawn and roam the house in a long, silent daze, opening cabinets, pulling aside curtains, looking beneath furniture with the desperate hope of glimpsing a small foot, a scrap of fabric, the slightest sign that her daughter had returned. Servants reported hearing her whispering to invisible figures, coaxing them to stay still, begging them not to hide anymore. There were moments when she clutched objects that had belonged to Masai, a hair ribbon, a small wooden toy, holding them so tightly that her hands trembled, her skin whitening beneath the pressure. At times she was overcome by uncontrollable sobbing, collapsing onto the floor as though her legs could no longer support even the weight of her sorrow. Other times, she spoke in calm, measured tones, asking attendants to prepare her daughter's favorite foods or requesting that someone fetch the girl from the garden, where she insisted she had just seen the flutter of her dress. Her husband tried to maintain order, consulting doctors who arrived with solemn expressions and soft-spoken diagnoses. They used words that carried a heavy clinical detachment: hallucinations, delusions, emotional collapse. But these terms were mere shadows of the reality unfolding before them. Deokhye's suffering was not an abstract condition, but the raw, unfiltered manifestation of a mother's heart, torn open so violently that the wound could not heal. The doctors recommended rest, medication, and eventually confinement, believing that distance from familiar surroundings might help her regain her sense of reality. But what was reality to a woman whose entire identity had already been eroded by forced exile, political manipulation, and years of solitude? What did it mean to ask her to return to herself when the last tether to her true self had vanished with her daughter? As the weeks stretched into months with no word of Masai's whereabouts, Deokhye's mental state deteriorated further. She began to forget the passage of time, asking repeatedly whether her daughter had returned that day, unaware that she had asked the same question only moments before. She experienced periods of agitation, during which she attempted to leave the house, convinced that Masai was waiting for her outside, calling her from a distance she could not measure. At other times, she fell into long stretches of silence, staring at a fixed point in the room, as though she were following the movement of someone unseen. Her declining condition made it increasingly difficult for her family to care for her at home, and the decision, one made with reluctance yet inevitability, was taken to admit her into a psychiatric institution. Committing her to such a place was a step shaped not only by medical recommendation, but also by the reality of societal expectations. Mental illness, particularly among women of noble status, carried a profound stigma, and her husband was under pressure to maintain outward appearances. Yet those who later reflected on the decision acknowledged that her suffering had reached a level that surpassed the capacity of a private household. And so, with her mind clouded by grief and her spirit frayed by unrelenting sorrow, Princess Deokhye was taken to a hospital in Matsuzawa, a place that would become both her refuge and her prison. The hospital grounds were expansive, surrounded by tall trees that filtered the sunlight through branches that swayed gently in the wind. Yet for Deokhye, these natural beauties were nothing more than distant shapes glimpsed through a fog that had settled between her and the world. Inside the ward, her days unfolded with monotonous regularity. Nurses guided her through routines meant to stabilize her, though she rarely responded with full awareness. There were moments when she recognized neither her surroundings nor the people who tended to her, moments when she called out for her daughter with such desperate clarity that the nurses were said to exchange sorrowful glances, knowing they could offer no explanation that would reach her. She was given treatments common for the era, some gentle, others harsh by modern standards. The physicians documented her condition, noting the cycles of lucidity and confusion, the sudden bursts of agitation, followed by long periods of profound withdrawal. They observed her tendency to clutch her hands tightly at her chest, as though holding an invisible child against her. They recorded her murmured conversations with someone who was not there, her tearful pleas for forgiveness, her long silences in which she seemed lost in a world that existed only within the fragile boundaries of her mind. It is difficult to reconstruct the full texture of her inner experience during those years, for she left behind no coherent writings from the period, and the accounts of those who cared for her are filtered through the perspectives of observers. Yet through the fragments that remain, notes, memories, reports, we sense the overwhelming weight of her loss, a sorrow so absolute that it broke the delicate structure of her consciousness. Her daughter's absence became the central axis around which her mind spun endlessly, unable to adapt, unable to surrender, unable to find ground upon which to rebuild. As the months slid into years, the world outside the hospital changed in profound ways. Japan would soon enter a turbulent period of war, devastation, and transformation. Korea would move toward liberation, though Deokhye would not be present to witness it. The palace where she had spent her childhood would fall into disuse, haunted by echoes of her footsteps. Yet within the quiet confines of the psychiatric ward, time lost its meaning. She remained suspended in a place where past and present collapsed into each other, where memories resurfaced and dissolved without warning, where the voice of her missing daughter, whether imagined or remembered, was the only constant thread she could still feel. Her collapse was not the result of a single moment, but the outcome of a lifetime shaped by forces beyond her control. Exile, political manipulation, isolation, and the unbearable weight of losing the one person who had restored meaning to her existence. This long descent into the dim corridors of her mind marks one of the most tragic chapters in her story, for it reveals not only her personal suffering, but the profound human cost of history's silent cruelties. And as she wandered through the blurred landscape of her thoughts, the name Masai remained the last clear word she held on to, uttered with the fragile hope that somewhere, somehow, the child she lost might still hear her. The newspaper page that had fluttered to the floor in some distant memory seemed to fall again in her mind, its whispering descent marking the slow turning of history beyond the confines of her hospital room. And from that faint rustle, the next chapter of Princess Deokhye's story emerged, a chapter defined not by her actions, but by the world shifting restlessly around her, while she remained locked within the fragile chambers of her own wounded consciousness. As she wandered through the dim corridors of Matsuzawa Hospital, often unaware of the passage of time, Korea, the homeland she had been torn from in youth, the land whose mountains and rhythms had shaped her earliest understanding of existence, was moving toward a transformation she could not witness or comprehend. Outside the windows of her confinement, empires rose and crumbled, wars erupted and subsided, nations were redrawn, and identities reimagined. Yet all of this unfolded far from the quiet ward where she lived out her days in a haze of sorrow and intermittent clarity. In 1945, when the Second World War finally ended and Japan announced its surrender, Korea awoke to long-awaited liberation. Crowds filled the streets with cries of joy, tears streaming down faces weathered by decades of occupation. Families embraced, strangers celebrated side by side, and the collective breath of a nation seemed to surge outward in renewed hope. But for Deokhye, whose identity had long been bound to the fate of the Korean monarchy, this moment of national rebirth took place beyond her awareness. She was not standing among her people in the sunlight of freedom, nor was she in a place where news of this turning point could penetrate meaningfully into her fractured mind. Within the hospital walls, she continued her slow routines, her memories still circling around the absence of her daughter, her thoughts drifting like fragile leaves carried on a current she could not control. Had she been well, the news of Korea's liberation would have stirred in her a complex blend of joy and sorrow. Joy for the end of her nation's suffering, sorrow for the monarchy's collapse, and perhaps a sharp ache for her own irretrievable place in that lost world. But in her state, the tides of history washed past her without leaving footprints. Wartime shortages had already made conditions in the hospital more difficult, and she experienced these hardships not as political realities, but as shifts in the routines of her care. Changes in the taste of food, the sound of hurried footsteps, the muted conversations of nurses who whispered of uncertain futures. Her husband, whose own life had grown increasingly constrained by wartime obligations and social expectations, visited her intermittently. He brought small offerings, flowers, fruit, cloth, but she did not always recognize him. There were days when she greeted him with the calm politeness of a stranger. Other days when she clung to him weeping, convinced for a moment that he had come to bring Masai back to her. The strain of this dual life, caring for a wife he could not comfort and navigating the upheavals of post-war Japan, left him weary, yet he did not sever the thread that connected them. His devotion, though distant and restrained, remained steady in its own quiet way. Meanwhile, in Korea, the royal family that once stood at the heart of the nation found itself in a precarious position. The monarchy had become a relic of the past, associated with both colonial manipulation and the waning days of Joseon sovereignty. The newly liberated nation looked forward, not backward, shaping its identity around modern governance rather than imperial lineage. Members of the royal family who remained in Korea lived in relative obscurity, their titles stripped of political meaning. Some endured poverty, others faded into anonymity, and still others were scattered across various countries, unable to reclaim the homes of their ancestors. Yet among the stories that circulated of the displaced and diminished royal lineage, the fate of Princess Deokhye remained largely unknown to the Korean public. Few knew she was alive. Fewer still knew she was living in a psychiatric institution abroad. Her name, once whispered with reverence in palace halls, slowly faded from public memory, becoming a shadow in historical footnotes. In Matsuzawa, her illness followed a pattern of fluctuations, moments of calm lucidity interrupted by long stretches of confusion. During her lucid periods, she sometimes spoke of her childhood in Korea, describing the palace gardens with remarkable clarity, recalling the scent of pine needles after rain, the soft feel of silk hanbok beneath her small hands, the distant sound of court musicians practicing melodies that drifted across the courtyards like old prayers. These recollections emerged like glimmers from a deep well, illuminating the fragments of her identity that still survived beneath the layers of grief. Nurses who listened to her noticed a change in the rhythm of her voice when she spoke of her homeland, a wistful cadence, tender yet deeply sorrowed, as though she were whispering secrets to herself. But these moments were brief. The shadows would soon return, and her mind would once again be engulfed by the image of her missing daughter, the echo of a name she could not stop calling. Japan's post-war society underwent rapid transformation during those years. Cities rebuilt, institutions reformed, and cultural attitudes shifted as the nation sought to recover from devastation. The mental health system, too, evolved gradually, though progress came slowly. Deokhye's care improved in small increments, more attentive supervision, changes in treatment approaches, but none of these developments eased the core of her suffering. Her illness was rooted not in chemical imbalance alone, but in the accumulation of traumas that had fractured her sense of self long before she entered the hospital. No amount of modern medicine could rewrite the story of exile, forced marriage, cultural displacement, or the unbearable grief of losing her child. Letters from Korea were scarce, partly due to the country's disorder in the aftermath of liberation, and partly because few knew where she was or how to reach her. She received occasional correspondence from relatives, though these letters often contained careful phrases, crafted with a formality that revealed more restraint than familiarity. Whether she fully understood them is uncertain. Sometimes she folded the letters neatly and tucked them under her pillow, as though keeping them close might somehow bridge the distance between her and the home she barely remembered. At other times, she allowed the letters to drift from her grasp, leaving them on the table where the corners curled over time, untouched. Her husband, carrying the weight of his own responsibilities and the quiet sorrow of a marriage shaped by circumstance rather than partnership, eventually found it impossible to care for her alone. His visits became less frequent as the years passed, not out of abandonment, but from the acceptance that her world no longer intersected meaningfully with his. She, in turn, did not seem to register the change. Her mind remained anchored to a single point in time, the moment her daughter vanished, rendering all other connections secondary or invisible. Meanwhile, Korea continued its march through political turmoil, division into North and South, war, reconstruction, nation-building. New leaders emerged, new ideologies took shape, and the memory of the monarchy receded even further. In this rapidly transforming landscape, the name of Princess Deokhye was scarcely mentioned. She had become, for all practical purposes, a forgotten figure, neither celebrated nor mourned, simply absent from the narrative of the nation's rebirth. And so she remained in her ward, wandering the same corridors, tracing the same loops of memory, speaking the same unanswered words into the quiet air. Her life had grown small, containing little beyond the boundaries of her illness, yet within her carried the vast, unspoken history of a dynasty's final breath. The newspaper page that had once fluttered downward, symbol of a world changing without her, continued to fall in her imagination, a reminder that history, indifferent and relentless, had moved forward, leaving her suspended in the soft shadow of a life that had diverged from its rightful course long ago. The dim corridor at the edge of the sanatorium seemed always to hover at the periphery of her awareness, a place where light thinned into a muted gray and footsteps softened into trembling echoes. And from that muted threshold, the next part of Princess Deokhye's story slowly emerged. One shaped not by clarity, but by the distant attempts of others to reclaim a life that had slipped beyond her reach. The decades following Korea's liberation saw many transformations across the peninsula. Governments rose and fell, ideologies clashed violently, and national identity was rebuilt upon foundations newly shaken by war. Amid these upheavals, memories of the old monarchy faded from public consciousness as people sought to anchor themselves in practical survival rather than nostalgic reverence. Yet for some, the thought of the last princess, living forgotten in a Japanese psychiatric institution, stirred a quiet ache, a sense that a fragment of Korea's soul had been left behind across the sea. Rumors of Deokhye's continued existence surfaced occasionally, carried by those who had known her in youth or had heard whispers from individuals sympathetic to the royal family. These murmurs traveled through delicate networks, old courtiers who had escaped to the south, journalists with an interest in overlooked histories, scholars searching for threads that had been lost in the chaos of war. Among them grew a subtle determination to confirm whether the princess, absent from all official records, was indeed still alive. Their efforts began quietly, for the political climate of the time made overt inquiries risky. Korea, in its early years of rebuilding, struggled to define its governance, and public association with the remnants of the royal line raised complicated questions. Some leaders worried that resurrecting ties to the monarchy might disrupt the fragile political order. Others argued that reclaiming the last princess was not merely an act of sentimentality, but a matter of national dignity. Yet regardless of motive, the search took shape slowly, fueled by individuals who believed that the forgotten deserved to be remembered, even if remembrance arrives decades too late. One of the earliest attempts came from Kim Ul-han, a distant relative and former court chamberlain who had known Deokhye as a child. He carried within him a persistent sorrow at the thought of her living in isolation, and in the late 1950s he began making inquiries during his visits to Japan. His search, hindered by bureaucratic barriers and political sensitivities, progressed painstakingly. It was difficult to obtain information about patients in psychiatric institutions, even more difficult when those patients belonged to a lineage weighed down by the history of colonial rule. Yet he persisted, following fragments of addresses, old testimonies, and hints that took him from one office to another, often receiving only vague replies. In many ways, his search mirrored the emotional landscape of Deokhye's own life, full of pauses, detours, and the quiet endurance of someone refusing to surrender hope. Meanwhile, in Korea, a small number of journalists grew curious about the royal family's unspoken fate. Among them was the novelist and journalist Choi Seong-yoon, whose interest in Korea's forgotten figures led him to investigate the life of the last princess. He pieced together old stories, delved into archives, and eventually traveled to Japan, where chance and persistence guided him to Matsuzawa Hospital. When he finally located Deokhye in the early 1960s, he found a woman who bore little resemblance to the princess he had imagined from historical accounts. She was older now, her hair streaked with gray, her expression distant yet strangely serene. Her eyes carried the dim glow of someone living between memory and oblivion, caught in a space where time had long ago dissolved into indistinct echoes. She did not immediately recognize her visitor, yet something in his presence stirred a flicker of awareness, a faint tremor of familiarity, though she could not place it. The discovery of her existence made its way back to Korea, where it stirred a wave of quiet astonishment. Many had believed the last princess long dead, or else folded irretrievably into the private world of Japan's aristocracy. The revelation that she was alive, though living in conditions defined by illness and isolation, elicited a mixture of empathy, curiosity, and regret. Conversations began to circulate among Korean officials and cultural figures about the possibility of bringing her home. Yet the matter was fraught with political tension. Korea, now divided and navigating its own developmental struggles, approached such symbolic gestures with caution. The government hesitated, unsure of how her return might be interpreted domestically or internationally. Some feared it might provoke unnecessary political sentiment. Others worried about the logistical and diplomatic complexities involved. Nonetheless, momentum gathered, driven by individuals who felt a deep moral weight in restoring the princess to her rightful homeland. Petitions were drafted, government offices weighed arguments, journalists urged action. Former palace attendants, now elderly and frail, expressed their longing to see her return. Even members of the South Korean public, especially those who remembered the monarchy's final years, felt a stirring of compassion, imagining the sorrow of a woman who had been separated not only from her country, but from her entire identity. During this period of growing interest, Deokhye herself remained largely unaware of the discussions surrounding her. Her mind, fragmented by years of mental collapse, drifted between brief lucidity and longer periods of withdrawal. She sometimes recognized her visitors, sometimes did not. On certain days, she seemed to remember the sound of Korean words, letting them escape her lips in a soft whisper, though their meaning appeared to float away from her almost as soon as she spoke them. On other days, she sat silently by the window, gazing out at the garden beyond the hospital wall. A small patch of earth where branches swayed and petals fell without pattern. Whether she sensed that something was shifting in the world beyond those walls remains uncertain. Yet some nurses recalled that she occasionally spoke of home with a softness that suggested a faint stirring within her, a fragile thread connecting her to the possibility of return. The movement to bring her back to Korea strengthened in the early 1960s, propelled by cultural advocates and officials who ultimately convinced the government that repatriating the last princess was not merely a symbolic gesture, but an act of national restoration. After prolonged negotiations, permissions were finally granted. In 1962, after nearly 4 decades of exile and more than a decade of hospital confinement, arrangements were made for her return. Yet even as preparations unfolded, uncertainty hung in the air. Would she understand what was happening? Would the journey unsettle her fragile mind? Would she even recognize the land she had left as a child? The day of her departure from Japan holds a quiet poignancy in the recollections of those who witnessed it. She was dressed carefully, as though being presented to the world for the first time in many years. Her hair brushed neatly, her garments chosen with respectful consideration. Some say she appeared calm, others recall a trace of confusion in her expression. Yet when she boarded the ship, or in some accounts, the plane, that would take her home, she carried within her the faint suggestion of someone moving toward a destiny she could no longer comprehend, but perhaps could still feel. The corridor at the edge of the sanatorium, with its dim light and muted echoes, receded behind her as she left Japan. Ahead lay a homeland transformed beyond recognition, a nation reborn in her absence, awaiting the return of a princess who had become, through sorrow and silence, one of its most forgotten children. The creak of the gate opening into a quiet garden lingered in the air, as though it had opened not merely upon a physical place, but upon a memory long buried beneath the weight of decades. And from that soft, hesitant sound, the next part of Princess Deokhye's life unfurled with a tenderness edged in sorrow. After more than 30 years of exile, years marked by loneliness, illness, and the silent collapse of her once bright world, she returned at last to the land where she had taken her earliest steps, where her first words had been spoken, where her childhood laughter had once echoed beneath palace eaves. Yet the Korea she returned to in 1962 was not the Korea she remembered. It was a nation divided, rebuilt, scarred by war, modernizing at a pace that left even its own people breathless. And for Deokhye, who arrived as a fragile woman in her late 40s, uncertain and trembling, the return was not a triumphant homecoming, but a quiet, bewildering step into a place that recognized her name, yet could no longer recognize her life. The day she arrived in Busan, the harbor brimmed with subdued anticipation. Officials had arranged a modest welcome, mindful of her fragile health. Photographs from that day show her stepping onto Korean soil with a distant, almost searching gaze, as though trying to locate within herself the memory of belonging. Some observers noted the way she held her hands close to her chest, a gesture both protective and vulnerable. Others remarked that when she heard Korean spoken around her, her eyes flickered with a fleeting expression. Perhaps recognition, perhaps confusion, perhaps something too delicate to assign a single meaning. For a woman who had lived in institutional silence, surrounded by foreign sounds and unfamiliar customs, the cadence of her mother tongue must have felt like a breeze moving through a long, closed room, stirring the dust of memories she had believed lost. Yet even as the language washed over her, the world around her bore little resemblance to the palace grounds of her youth. The Korea that welcomed her back was rebuilding from the ashes of war. Its streets buzzed with urgency, filled with people striving for survival rather than ceremony. There were few remnants of the royal presence that had once symbolized national unity. Instead, the monarchy existed in the realm of memory, mentioned occasionally in books or whispered by elderly citizens who still remembered the crimson gates of Changdeokgung, standing tall before their lives changed irrevocably. From Busan, Deokhye was escorted to Seoul, where her return was met with quiet respect but little public fanfare. Some citizens who heard of her arrival felt a gentle sorrow ripple through them, recalling the last princess who had vanished into history, unaware she had endured so much suffering. Others regarded her return with curiosity, surprised to learn she was still alive after decades of silence. And there were those, particularly older Koreans, who felt an ache of guilt, for the country had lost her once, through the force of empire and again through the neglect of memory. When she arrived at Changdeokgung, the palace of her childhood, the moment held a fragile poignancy. The palace, though preserved, bore marks of time and abandonment. Weeds had grown in places once carefully tended, stones had weathered under the sun and rain, and the corridors that had once hummed with the footsteps of attendants now lay in stillness. For Deokhye, stepping through the gates was like crossing the threshold between dream and waking, a dream she struggled to recall, a waking she could barely comprehend. Some say she paused for a long moment upon entering, her eyes wandering across the courtyard as though searching for familiar faces, familiar trees, familiar echoes. Whether she recognized the palace remains uncertain. Her mind, shaped by years of illness, existed in shifting currents, yet something in her posture suggested that the place stirred a distant resonance within her, a memory rising slowly from the depths like an object long submerged. She was settled in Naxeon Hall, a secluded area of the palace complex that became her sanctuary for the rest of her life. There, she lived under the care of relatives and attendants who treated her with gentleness, guiding her through daily routines, offering companionship without forcing conversation. Her life slowed into rhythms shaped by the palace grounds, the rustle of leaves in the courtyard, the distant call of magpies, the soft sweep of brooms against stone paths. Sometimes she wandered the garden in silence, her steps careful, almost childlike, pausing to touch the bark of old trees or to watch the fish gliding beneath the surface of the pond. To onlookers, these gestures seemed like attempts to reconnect with something she could not articulate, as though she sensed that her life had begun here, even if the details had faded from her mind. Visitors came occasionally, journalists, former palace attendants, curious scholars, but her interactions with them were often brief and shaped by the limitations of her illness. There were moments when she recalled a face or responded with a spark of clarity, but these moments were fleeting. More often, she remained quiet, her thoughts drifting inwards, anchored less to the present than to the distant past where her daughter's voice still seemed to echo. Even in Korea, even surrounded by the familiarity of her childhood surroundings, the absence of Maasai remained the central void in her life. At times, she would ask softly, almost absently, whether her daughter was coming to visit, whether she had been seen nearby. Her caretakers responded gently, reminding her that many years had passed, but the words scarcely registered. For Deokhye, time had folded in upon itself. The threads of her memory intersected in a looping pattern, where the past and present mingled without boundary. Yet despite her fragile mental state, those who saw her in these years described moments of surprising grace. On clear mornings, she would sit beneath the shade of a pine tree, her gaze lifted toward the sky, her expression calm, as though listening to something only she could hear. On certain festivals, attendants dressed her in hanbok, the fabric soft and flowing, and for brief moments she carried herself with a posture reminiscent of the young princess she once had been, the last blooming flower of a fading dynasty. In these rare flashes, one could glimpse the quiet dignity that had survived within her, even as so much else had been lost. Her relatives, particularly Princess Namyong and other surviving members of the Yi family, visited her often, speaking to her with affection and helping her navigate the changing world around her. Though she rarely spoke at length, she responded warmly to familiar faces, her expression softening when someone mentioned her childhood or recited a poem she had once learned. These interactions, though limited, seemed to offer her small moments of connection, threads that tied her gently to the world beyond her illness. Still, the palace was no longer a place of power or ceremony. It was a quiet refuge, a place where a forgotten princess lived out her days in relative obscurity. Visitors walked the grounds unaware that the last princess of Joseon resided behind the wooden doors of a modest building, her life unfolding in quiet solitude as her country surged forward into modernity. Korea grew around her, New buildings rose, new roads expanded, new generations spoke of progress rather than lineage, and Deokhye, once a symbol of national continuity, now became a silent witness to change, her presence known only to a small circle who cared for her. In this way, her final decades passed, slowly, quietly shaped by moments of gentle lucidity and long stretches of silence. She lived in the palace that had once framed her earliest memories, yet she remained separated from its past by the fragile veil of her mind. Even so, the act of returning to Korea restored a measure of dignity to her life, allowing her to spend her remaining years on the soil where she truly belonged. And when the creak of the palace gate closed softly each evening, the sound seemed to envelop her in a tender embrace, as if the old walls themselves recognized their long-lost daughter and held her in the only way they could. The dust drifting through a soft ray of afternoon light seemed to hang suspended in the quiet air, each mote turning slowly as though time itself had exhaled and paused. And from that gentle stillness, the next part of Princess Deokhye's life emerged, a chapter defined by the muted rhythms of her final years within the sheltered confines of Nakseon Hall. After her long and sorrow-filled exile, after decades spent in the confusion of institutional care, her return to Korea had given her a sanctuary rather than a restoration. She would live out the remainder of her life, not as the princess she was born to be, nor as a political symbol reclaimed by a grateful nation, but simply as a fragile woman, finding moments of quiet in a world that had transformed beyond recognition. Nakseon Hall, tucked within the sprawling grounds of Cheongdeokgung, became the cradle of her last decades. Its wooden floors, polished smooth by centuries of footsteps, carried echoes of a once vibrant royal household. Yet by the time Deokhye returned, the palace had become less a seat of power and more a historical relic, a serene enclosure where the past lingered like a faint scent in the air. The gardens, once tended with the precision of ceremonial life, now grew with a natural, unhurried grace. Old trees stretched their branches as if standing watch over the quiet figure who often wandered beneath them. The ponds reflected the passing seasons with calm resignation, lotus leaves drifting across their surfaces in summer and thin ice forming in winter's hush. And through these shifting landscapes, Princess Deokhye walked with slow, deliberate steps, as though she feared the world beneath her feet might vanish if she moved too quickly. Her daily life settled into a gentle pattern. Attendants helped her rise each morning, assisting her with her garments, brushing her hair with careful strokes that echoed the rituals of her childhood. Sometimes she hummed without realizing it, soft, wavering melodies that seemed to rise from a distant corner of her memory. Melodies once sung by court ladies who had long since passed into history. She took her breakfasts quietly, eating with small, controlled motions that reflected years of disciplined upbringing, even though her mind no longer dwelled on the etiquette behind them. Occasionally, she paused mid-bite, her gaze drifting beyond the room as if a memory had brushed lightly against her awareness before dissolving again into the mist. Most mornings, after she had eaten, she walked through the courtyard. She favored a particular path beneath the canopy of an old pine, a tree that had stood in that place since before her birth. Its branches arched above her like protective arms, and she often reached out to touch its rough bark as she passed, her fingers lingering upon its texture with an almost childlike fascination. To those who watched her, it seemed as though the natural world stirred something within her more deeply than conversation ever could. Birds hopping near the ground caught her attention, their small movements reflecting a rhythm she seemed to understand instinctively. When autumn arrived and the leaves turned crimson and gold, she would stand among them for long stretches, her expression tranquil, as though the shifting colors brought her a peace she could not find through words. Her interactions with others remained limited, though not entirely absent. Relatives visited regularly, some with genuine affection, others with a sense of duty. They spoke to her gently, updating her on family matters she could not fully follow. At times she responded with faint smiles, nods, or soft murmurs. On rare days, clarity flickered across her features like a brief return of dawn. She would recall a name, a face, or a fragment of an old song. During these lucid moments, those around her felt a tender ache, witnessing a spark of the princess she had once been, graceful, thoughtful, dignified. Yet the moments were fleeting. The shadows of her illness soon returned, weaving their soft veil across her mind and drawing her back into the quiet landscape where memory and present blended indistinguishably. The attendants who cared for her grew to treat her not as a figure of royal stature, but as a beloved elder, someone to be protected with patience and compassion. They learned the rhythms of her moods, the subtle signs that signaled distress or calm. When she seemed troubled, they sat beside her, offering warm tea and soothing voices. When she retreated into silence, they remained nearby without crowding her, respecting the fragile boundaries of her inner world. Their devotion brought a gentle continuity to her days, sustaining her through the quiet stretches of her later years. Evenings in Naxeon Hall often carried a serene solemnity. Lanterns glowed softly along the corridors, their light swaying with the slightest breeze. Shadows danced across the papered doors, giving the impression of figures moving in rooms long abandoned. Sometimes Deokhye sat beneath one of these lanterns, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the shadows shift as though they were old companions returning for brief visits. There were nights when she whispered to them, not in full sentences but in fragments, half-formed thoughts drifting into the air. Those who heard her could not always understand the meaning of her words, yet they sensed the longing behind them. A longing that stretched back to her youth, to the palace that once thrived around her, to the daughter whose absence still shaped her inner landscape like an unhealed wound. Her mental state remained fragile, yet stable, in its own quiet way. She no longer experienced the violent episodes of confusion and distress that had marked her earlier years in the hospital, but neither did she fully escape the fog that enveloped her thoughts. Instead, she existed in a gentle middle ground, a place where the harsh edges of her trauma had softened but not disappeared, where the boundaries of her identity had blurred but not dissolved entirely. She remembered enough to recognize the scent of home, the shape of familiar objects, the echo of old rituals, yet she forgot enough that the burdens of her past did not overwhelm her daily existence. In this sense, her return to Korea gave her a final mercy, the chance to drift peacefully through her remaining years, surrounded by the landscapes of her childhood rather than the sterile walls of a foreign institution. She outlived many of those who had known her in her youth. Old courtiers who remembered her as a child passed away one by one. Relatives who had petitioned for her return grew frail, their own lives approaching their quiet conclusions. The country outside the palace walls changed rapidly, new buildings rising, new technologies emerging, new generations forming their own narratives of identity. Deokhye remained largely untouched by these transformations, existing in her own slow-moving realm where time unfolded differently. Yet her presence held a quiet significance for those aware of her story. She was a living link to a chapter of Korean history defined by both grandeur and sorrow, a chapter many preferred not to revisit too often. Visitors who encountered her in the palace grounds sometimes felt a hush fall over them, as though they were witnessing history made flesh, not in the form of a triumphant figure, but in the form of a gentle, fragile woman whose life embodied the tragedy of a nation's fall and the quiet dignity of survival. She represented not victory but memory, not royalty but endurance. But as she moved through the last years of her life, her days grew increasingly quiet. She spent more time resting in her chambers, wrapped in soft blankets, occasionally gazing out the window at the garden, where the trees continued their slow conversation with the wind. There were moments when attendants found her smiling faintly. No one knew at what or at whom. Perhaps she saw her daughter in some distant corner of her mind. Perhaps she recalled a time before sorrow had cast its long shadow across her life. Or perhaps it was simply the peace that had finally settled into her after so many years of turmoil. When she passed away in 1989, her death was recorded without fanfare, yet it stirred a gentle ripple across the hearts of those who knew her story. She was laid to rest with the dignity that had followed her from birth, a dignity she had carried quietly through every storm she endured. In the days that followed, sunlight filtered through the trees of Cheongdeokgung, much as it had during her childhood, illuminating the halls where she had taken her first steps and the gardens where she had wandered in her final years. And in that soft light, the dust continued to drift, as though the palace itself remembered her, not as the last princess of a fallen dynasty, but as a fragile soul who had returned at last to the place where she belonged, even if only to spend her final years wrapped in the quiet embrace of home. Twilight deepened across the old courtyard, the softening colors of day sinking slowly into muted shades of blue and gray. And from that quiet descent, the next part of Princess Deokye's story unfolded, an unhurried meditation on the cost of a life lived under burdens she never chose, a life defined less by the grand currents of history than by the subtle and unyielding pressures that pressed upon her from childhood. As the evening shadows lengthened over the palace tiles, one could almost sense how the weight of her past lay upon her final years, not in dramatic flourishes, but in the quiet rhythms of thought, memory, and sorrow that shaped the contours of her days. For long before she returned to Korea, long before her mind began to unravel in grief, the framework of her tragedy had been set in place by forces outside her control. Forces that carved her fate with the cold precision of political necessity, national loss, and imperial ambition. To understand the true cost of her life is to consider the fragility of her identity, stretched across the paradoxes of her existence. She was born a princess, yet lived most of her life without the freedoms normally denied to royalty. She embodied the last breath of a dynasty, yet came of age in a world where dynasties no longer held power. She was cherished as a child but discarded as a symbol when she grew inconvenient. And when she became a young woman, instead of choosing her own path, she was moved like a piece in a political arrangement. Her marriage, and later her exile, serving purposes not her own. In this sense, the sadness that shaped her life was not a sudden collapse, but the accumulation of countless small constraints, each one tightening until the shape of her destiny was altered beyond recognition. When she was a child, she had wandered through palace courtyards believing, with the innocence of youth, that the world she inhabited was secure. Its rituals constant, its walls protective. She had not known that the foundations beneath her were crumbling, that beyond the gates, a foreign empire was weaving plans that would reshape not only her future, but the future of her entire lineage. As she grew, the subtle changes around her, the cautious footsteps of attendants, the muted expressions of ministers, the altered rhythms of court life, formed a pattern she could sense but not understand. Even then, the cost of her existence had begun, the silent burden of embodying a heritage that others sought to either exploit or erase. Her removal to Japan, framed as an opportunity for education, carried with it a profound dislocation that shaped her entire adulthood. For while the transition seemed orderly and polite, its emotional consequences were devastating. She lost not only her homeland, but the rhythms that had defined her from infancy, the sounds, scents, textures, and languages that root a person to their culture. In Japan, she lived as a guest whose presence was laden with political symbolism. The subtle distance with which she was treated, the constant awareness of being monitored, the deep loneliness of life lived between cultures, all of these constituted a form of silent erosion, wearing away at the core of her identity. Over time, this erosion became the foundation for deeper fractures, especially as she entered adulthood and faced decisions made entirely without her consent. Her marriage represented another layer of cost, one measured not in drama but in the steady fading of possibility. She entered the union with the composure expected of her class, but beneath that exterior, she experienced the quiet dismantling of agency. Her husband, though not cruel, was distant, his affection bound by propriety rather than intimacy. Her home life carried the form of stability without its warmth, trapping her within routines that gave no room for the softness of personal desire. And though motherhood offered her a brief sanctuary of joy, that joy was fragile, threatened by the pressures surrounding her daughter's identity and future. The disappearance of her daughter marked the culmination of all these accumulated costs. The sorrow that followed did not arise from a single loss, but from the echo of every previous loss she had endured. The loss of her homeland, the loss of her freedom, the loss of her place in the world, and the loss of the stability that might have anchored her mental health. When Masai vanished, the delicate structure of her spirit fractured completely. The grief was not simply maternal, it was existential. Her daughter had been her last anchor, the only living connection to her sense of self. Without that connection, she drifted into the depths of despair, her mind unable to bear the weight of her accumulated sorrows. Her years in the psychiatric hospital represented another kind of cost, one measured in the quiet erasure of identity. For in those sterile rooms, attended by strangers who had no understanding of her past, she became less a princess and more a patient, less a symbol and more a case file. The rituals of palace life faded from her daily experience, replaced by the monotonous routines of institutional care. Her memories, already blurred by grief, shifted further into abstraction, becoming fragments of a world that no one around her shared. The cost of exile, of political manipulation, of personal tragedy. All of it converged upon her in that lonely place, filling her days with a quiet emptiness that, at times, seemed more painful than overt suffering. Her return to Korea, though welcomed by those who cared about her story, did not reverse the course of her life. Instead, it offered her a gentle landing, a place where the cost of her journey could settle into stillness rather than continuing to accumulate. In her final years, she experienced moments of peace in the gardens of Nakseon Hall, moments where the weight of her past seemed to lighten as she listened to the wind moving through the trees. Yet even these peaceful periods carried a certain melancholy, for they were separated from the life she might have lived had history not swept her along its relentless tide. The true cost of her life was not simply the tragedies that befell her, but the layers of choice that were denied to her. She was never given the freedom to define herself, to choose her path, to love on her own terms, or to preserve her connection to the world she cherished. Instead, she was shaped by forces that viewed her more as a symbol than as a human being, more as a tool for political narratives than as a woman with her own needs and hopes. And yet, despite all these losses, she endured. In her endurance lies a quiet dignity, one that does not erase the cost of her life, but acknowledges it with tenderness rather than bitterness. She carried her sorrow without turning it into cruelty. She bore her burdens without seeking to impose them upon others. And even as her mind faltered, her spirit retained a softness that spoke not of defeat, but of remarkable gentleness in the face of relentless suffering. As twilight settled fully over the courtyard, the last traces of daylight fading into the blue shadows of evening, one could almost imagine Princess Deokhye standing beneath the trees, her silhouette still and contemplative, embodying the quiet truth of her life, that even the most fragile among us can bear immense burdens, and that resilience can take forms so subtle they are visible only in the way a person continues to breathe, continues to walk, continues to endure. The overlapping voices that had faded into the wind seemed to murmur still. fragments of memory drifting like half-forgotten conversations carried across a long stretch of time. And from those indistinct echoes, the next part of Princess Deokhye's story emerged. A quiet exploration of how others spoke of her, how they remembered her, how their recollections shaped the contours of her life long after her own voice had fallen silent beneath layers of sorrow. For the narrative of her existence was never built solely upon her actions. It was woven from the memories of those who moved around her, attendants who cared for her as a child, palace officials who witnessed her early years, relatives who drifted between affection and obligation, journalists who searched for her after decades of silence, and even strangers whose impressions of her were formed at a distance. Each voice offered a different thread, and together they created a tapestry marked by tenderness, regret, misunderstanding, and unspoken guilt. In the early years of her life, palace attendants spoke of her with a reverence, shaped by both affection and duty. They remembered her as a quiet child, delicate in health yet possessing a surprising depth of gaze, as though she sensed more than she could articulate. Some said she carried an air of solemnity from infancy, a solemnity softened only when she heard the rustle of silk or the gentle murmur of voices she trusted. Others recalled moments when she laughed unexpectedly, her face lighting with a sweetness that brightened entire rooms, offering a glimpse of the joy she might have known had the world around her not fallen into decline. These attendants, most of whom died before she returned from exile, carried their memories as private treasures, whispering stories of her into the ears of younger generations, who would remember her only through these fading accounts. Ministers and officials of the late Joseon court held more complicated memories. To some, she symbolized the future of the dynasty, even if only in sentimental terms. To others, she represented the final fragility of a kingdom under siege, a small child surrounded by adults who could no longer protect the dignity of their throne. They described her with the distance of political observers, noting her frail health, the emperor's tender affection, the precariousness of her position as a princess, born into a world where titles were becoming ornamental rather than authoritative. Their recollections, shaped by the turmoil of the era, often carried an undertone of inadequacy, as though they knew even then that they had failed to shield her from the forces tightening around her life. Her teachers in Japan described her differently still. They remembered a student who was polite, quiet, earnest in her efforts to adapt, yet always slightly withdrawn. They noted her soft-spoken manner, her tendency to observe rather than participate, her careful attention to instructions. But they also spoke of a lingering sadness in her eyes, a kind of gentle distance that never fully dissipated, even in moments of apparent contentment. Some suspected homesickness, though they could not grasp the depth of what she had lost when removed from her homeland and placed in an environment that viewed her heritage with political ambition rather than genuine understanding. To them, she was a model student with an indefinable melancholy, an enigma wrapped in courteous silence. Members of her husband's family offered a different chorus of voices, shaped by their own social expectations and cultural assumptions. Some saw her as a dutiful, soft-spoken wife, gracious and temperate, though undeniably foreign. Others regarded her with a kind of distant sympathy, unable to fully understand the grief she carried, but sensing its persistent presence nonetheless. A few relatives, especially those who had interacted with her more closely during her years of motherhood, remembered moments of warmth, a tender glance exchanged with her daughter, a gentle smile during family gatherings, a quiet resilience that revealed itself in subtle gestures. Yet even these memories were tinged with the awareness that she never fully belonged to their world, her spirit anchored elsewhere even as her life unfolded in Japan. Her friends, though few, described her in softer, more intimate tones. Some recalled the delicate grace with which she poured tea, the thoughtful pauses before she spoke, the way she listened with her whole presence, even when she struggled to find the right words. They remembered her fondness for poetry, her gentle curiosity about the world, her hesitant laughter when something genuinely delighted her. To these friends, she was not a princess, but a tender, fragile woman burdened by circumstances she never voiced directly, yet carried in every subtle shift of her expression. They sensed the tension within her, the longing for home, the weight of duty, the quiet isolation etched into her posture. But they also recognized the gentleness that remained unbroken despite all she endured. After her daughter's disappearance, the voices surrounding her shifted again. Doctors and nurses who cared for her during her collapse spoke of her with a sorrow often found in those who witness suffering they cannot alleviate. Some described the way she clutched imaginary objects, her hands tightening as though holding a child who had slipped from her arms. Others whispered of her wandering the halls, calling out softly, her voice thin with desperation. They spoke of her moments of clarity, brief flashes when she recognized a face or spoke a coherent thought, but also of the long stretches when confusion enveloped her like a shroud. These caregivers remembered her with compassion, not as a fallen royal figure, but as a mother whose grief had consumed her mind. Their accounts carry a painful tenderness, for they saw not the symbol but the human being behind the tragedy. When journalists and writers rediscovered her in Japan decades later, their voices added another layer to her story. They approached her with a mixture of curiosity, pity, and reverence. Some were struck by the quiet dignity she still possessed, even in her weakened state. Others felt unsettled by the profound silence that surrounded her, as though they had stepped into a room where history itself had been paused. In their articles and books, they attempted to convey the enormity of her suffering and the harshness of her fate, though their words often reflected their own interpretations of her rather than her true self. Their accounts rekindled public interest and compassion, yet they also contributed to the myth-making that would follow her death. Myth-making that sometimes blurred the line between historical truth and emotional narrative. After her return to Korea, the voices grew gentler. Relatives who visited her at Nakseon Hall described her with affection, noting the small signs of peace that emerged in her later years. They spoke of her wandering the gardens with slow, meditative steps, of her fascination with falling leaves, of the way she sometimes paused to listen to the wind with a soft, serene expression. Attendants remembered her moments of lucidity, when she recited old poems, hummed childhood melodies, or recognized a familiar scent. They recalled her quiet gestures of gratitude, her faint smiles, the simple tranquility that settled over her as she aged. These memories painted her final years, not as a continuation of her earlier suffering, but as a gentle easing into stillness, a soft retreat into the rhythms of the place where her life had begun. Yet even as these compassionate voices surrounded her, other voices remained, voices shaped by misunderstanding or distance. Some viewed her as a tragic figure defined solely by victimhood. Others romanticized her suffering, turning her into a symbol of national loss. A few dismissed her entirely, believing the monarchy irrelevant to modern Korea. Each voice, shaped by its own lens, contributed to the collective memory of Princess Deokhye, creating a mosaic of impressions that sometimes aligned with truth and sometimes drifted into interpretation. And so, the overlapping voices that spoke of her, those tender, those sorrowful, those confused, those reverent, merged into the soft wind that continued to carry her story forward. Each voice offered a glimpse into how she was perceived, yet none could fully capture the depth of the life she lived beneath those perceptions. As the wind faded into the quiet of the evening, the question lingered gently. In the end, do we remember her as she truly was, or only as reflections cast through the minds of those who witnessed pieces of her journey? The closed archive box, gathering dust, seemed to sit just at the edge of visibility, its presence like a small, sealed vessel of forgotten truths. And from that quiet image, the next part of Princess Deokhye's story unfolded, an exploration of the long decades when her name slipped almost entirely from public consciousness, when even the traces of her life seemed buried beneath layers of indifference, secrecy, and the swift march of a nation determined to move forward. In those years, she had become a memory not actively erased, but quietly neglected, a figure whose significance faded not through deliberate dismissal, but through the simple exhaustion of people trying to survive in a world reshaped by war, division, and rapid modern transformation. The period after her removal to Japan and the collapse of her mental health formed a long, unspoken silence in Korea. The royal family, once central to the cultural and political fabric of the nation, had become a relic of the past, a past too intertwined with the humiliation of colonization for many to approach without discomfort. The monarchy had not merely fallen, it had been dissolved under foreign rule, manipulated into a powerless appendage of the Japanese imperial system. To remember the royals meant remembering the erosion of sovereignty, the treaties signed under pressure, the symbolic resignations, and the slow stripping away of national autonomy. In such a climate, it became easier for the nation to distance itself from the monarchy's remnants than to preserve its memory with nuance. Princess Deokhye, born late in the dynasty, fragile in health and taken abroad while still a child, occupied a particularly vulnerable place in this complicated emotional terrain. With no political role, no public agency, and no one to advocate for her after her father's death, she slipped naturally into obscurity. No official documents detailing her life circulated widely. No portraits of her adulthood were displayed in public spaces. Few people knew what had become of her after the forced marriage arranged by Japanese authorities. Even among those who remembered her childhood existence, rumors overshadowed facts. Some believed she had died during the war. Others said she had become completely assimilated into Japanese society. Still others whispered that she had vanished entirely, perhaps by choice, perhaps by tragedy, though they could not articulate the form such a tragedy might have taken. In this fog of rumor, the truth that she lived confined in a psychiatric facility remained unspoken. Even her relatives in Korea, fragmented by war and scattered by circumstance, rarely discussed her openly. Some were unsure of her whereabouts. Others believed contact was impossible or discouraged by the political atmosphere. Her story, full of sorrow, displacement, and mental suffering, was difficult to tell in a society where the scars of colonization remained tender and where mental illness carried its own profound stigma. Silence settled over her like dust, settling over an abandoned record. During the decades of Korea's reconstruction, the national narrative focused on industrial growth, modernization, and the forging of a new identity rooted in resilience rather than historical defeat. In textbooks, the final years of the Joseon dynasty were condensed into timelines marked by treaty dates and foreign invasions. The monarchy's human stories, their hopes, fears, vulnerabilities, were glossed over. There was no space for the tenderness of a forgotten princess whose life had been dictated by the very forces that shattered the nation's independence. And so the memory of Deokhye lay dormant, tucked away in private recollections and scattered documents, like an unopened archive box whose significance could be felt but not seen. Even abroad, her existence receded into the quiet machinery of institutional life. In Matsuzawa Hospital, she became a figure known primarily to caregivers whose job required steadiness rather than curiosity. They observed her symptoms, documented her episodes, and provided routine care, but they did not delve into the historical narrative behind her name. To them, she was a patient in need of stability, not a princess whose story carried the weight of a nation's sorrow. Her identity, once inscribed in royal genealogies, became a footnote in hospital records, clinical, anonymized, devoid of context. Her past dissolved into the background of her present, unnoticed by the world beyond the hospital walls. Meanwhile, in Korea, the monarchy's physical remnants fell into disrepair. Some palace buildings crumbled. Others were repurposed. The descendants of the royal family lived in relative obscurity, their aristocratic lineage offering little advantage in a society focused on economic survival. Even their graves, scattered in various locations, drew little attention. The cultural memory of royalty became abstract, detached from the real lives of the people who had once embodied it. And in that numbness of forgetting, Deokye's name became a faint echo at best. Occasionally, fragments of her story resurfaced in whispered recollections among older Koreans. An elderly court lady might mention her with a soft note of longing. A former tutor might recall the fragile child who loved plum blossoms in the palace gardens. A distant relative might mention her name in passing, unsure whether she was alive or dead. These scattered memories flickered like low flames, too faint to illuminate her story, but persistent enough to ensure it did not vanish entirely. It was these faint, flickering recollections that later inspired journalists and researchers to begin searching for her decades after her disappearance from Korean life. Yet during the darkest years of her absence, perhaps the most poignant silence came from the ordinary people of Korea, who never knew she existed at all. New generations grew up unaware that the last princess lived across the sea in sorrow, unaware that the monarchy's final heir had suffered not in a palace, but in a hospital room far from home. History textbooks, simplified for clarity, left her out. Public discourse, focused on modernization, had no place for her, and so she became the invisible figure behind a story too painful to retell fully, too delicate to confront, too easily overshadowed by the sweeping dramas of national change. In this long forgetting, there is a kind of tragedy that extends beyond the personal. It is the tragedy of how a nation's most vulnerable stories vanish first, how the voices of those who suffer quietly often fade beneath the thunder of political events. It is the tragedy of how trauma, when unaddressed, silences not only individuals, but entire lineages. For if anyone had paused to ask, what became of the last princess, they might have uncovered a story that revealed not just her sorrow, but the deeper wounds carried by Korea during its years of occupation and transition. But the silence was not absolute. Even as dust gathered on the archive box of her memory, a few individuals began to tug gently at its lid, sensing that the story of Princess Deokhye deserved not abandonment, but retrieval. Their efforts, small at first, would eventually lift her from obscurity and return her to the heart of the nation's consciousness. And yet, in those years when her name faded into near invisibility, the palace halls she once walked stood quietly, their wooden beams whispering her story to the wind, waiting for someone, anyone, to listen again. The single candle flickering in the dimness seemed to waver as though stirred by a breath from long ago, its flame stretching and shrinking in a slow, uncertain rhythm. And from that tenuous glow, the next part of Princess Deokye's story emerged, a reflection on the rediscovery that gently lifted her from the archives of forgetting and brought her name back into the light of public memory. It was not a sudden awakening, but a gradual rekindling, a flame coaxed to life by writers, historians, journalists, and ordinary citizens who sensed that among the fractured remnants of Korea's past, her story held something urgently human, something worth reclaiming after decades of quiet erasure. The movement toward rediscovery began, as many restorations do, with a single voice refusing to accept silence. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the journalist and novelist Choi Seong-yoon became deeply compelled by rumors surrounding the fate of Korea's last princess. He had heard whispers, half-remembered testimonies from elderly courtiers, fragments mentioned among historians, that Deokhye had not died young, as some believed, but had been taken to Japan and lost somewhere within the vast gray corridors of institutional care. Most dismissed these whispers as speculation, yet something in them struck him with a sense of unfinished truth, as though a torn page of history were waiting to be rewritten. He felt that if the story proved false, he would have lost nothing. But if it proved true, a forgotten life could at last be restored to its rightful place. Choi's search took him across newspapers, dusty archives, and the recollections of those few who still remembered the princess as a child. His journey involved uncertainty, false leads, long hours of travel, and conversations laced with hesitation. Eventually, after following delicate threads of information through bureaucratic offices and private records, he stood at the doors of Matsuzawa Hospital in Tokyo, a place where stories often ended rather than began. Inside those walls, he found a woman seated quietly near a window, her posture gentle, her gaze wandering across the gardens beyond the glass. Her hair had grayed, her features softened, and her voice had grown faint from years of disuse. But there, beneath the layers of time and sorrow, stood Princess Deokhye, still alive, still breathing, still waiting, though perhaps not consciously, for someone to remember her. It was said that when Choi addressed her in Korean, her eyes flickered with a brief spark, as though some forgotten corner of her mind stirred in response. The words of her native language, long buried beneath decades of Japanese instructions and the haze of illness, brushed against her consciousness like a faint melody returning after years of silence. Choi observed her with a tenderness mingled with shock. He later wrote that she appeared like a soul wandering between worlds, living in a state where the past glimmered only in fragments. His articles, published upon his return to Korea, revealed the truth of her existence to the nation. The last princess had not vanished. She had simply been forgotten. The reaction in Korea was quiet at first, shaped by the complexities of the era. The country was rebuilding, its priorities rooted in economic survival and national security. A princess returning from a psychiatric hospital in Japan was not a matter every citizen could easily process or place within the narratives of progress and modernization. And yet, beneath the surface, something stirred, an awakening of compassion, perhaps even a shared sense of responsibility. The idea that a member of the royal family had endured such profound suffering abroad resonated with many Koreans who understood the scars of colonialism deeply. Her story became a mirror reflecting the nation's wounds, reminding people of a past they had tried but never fully succeeded in forgetting. As discussions grew, the possibility of bringing her back to her homeland took shape. But this process was not simple. It required delicate diplomacy, for Korea's government was cautious about the implications of restoring a royal figure to the public sphere. They feared political misinterpretation. They worried about stirring complex emotions tied to the monarchy's fall. And yet, the moral weight of her story outweighed those concerns. The movement to bring her home gained momentum, driven by writers, activists, and members of the surviving Yi royal family. Their efforts were guided not by political ambition, but by a sense of cultural restoration, a desire to reclaim a life unjustly uprooted. By 1962, after negotiations with Japanese authorities and careful arrangements for her care, Princess Deokhye was finally brought back to Korea. Her return did not prompt grand ceremonies or national celebrations. Instead, it unfolded with a quiet solemnity, befitting her personality and the fragile state of her health. Photographs from that time show her standing beside relatives who guided her gently, her expression soft and somewhat bewildered, as though she sensed the significance of the moment without fully comprehending it. Her presence in Korea gradually became known to the public, sparking a subtle resurgence of interest in the final years of the Joseon dynasty. People began to speak of her with empathy, reflecting on the tragic arc of her life, the beloved child of a fading monarchy, the princess sent abroad under colonial pressure, the mother who lost her only daughter, the woman whose mind collapsed under unbearable grief. Newspapers wrote cautiously phrased articles, cultural scholars revisited historical documents, and older citizens shared their memories of small, fleeting glimpses of her during their youth. For many, her story transcended royalty. It became a symbol of the countless lives reshaped by the dark currents of Korea's occupation and division. As time passed, her rediscovery inspired creative works, novels, plays, films, biographies. These works did not merely recount historical facts. They breathed emotional depth into her tragedy, offering audiences a way to mourn collectively for someone who had been denied the right to mourn for herself. Some dramatizations added embellishments, others simplified events, yet all of them contributed to reestablishing her place within the cultural consciousness. Through these artistic interpretations, Princess Deokhye emerged as a figure of empathy rather than authority, a woman whose gentle suffering resonated across generations. Her family, too, played a role in this restoration. Surviving relatives visited her regularly in Changdeokgung's Nakseon Hall, helping her reconnect with fragments of her past. Even as her mind drifted between clarity and confusion, the presence of familiar faces seemed to offer her a sense of belonging she had not felt in decades. Photographs taken during these years show her seated beside them, her hands folded neatly, her gaze calm. Though she could not articulate the full breadth of her experiences, her quiet presence spoke volumes of resilience, of sorrow, of the enduring human spirit buried beneath the layers of history. Yet it would be romanticized to say that rediscovery healed her. Her suffering had carved deep channels within her mind, channels that no amount of recognition or affection could entirely fill. She lived her final decades with the soft drifting of someone who has learned to exist in the calm waters left after the storm. Even as the nation reabsorbed her story, even as her name grew familiar again in cultural conversation, she moved through her days without conscious awareness of the restoration unfolding around her. And perhaps this was fitting, for her rediscovery was not for her alone, it was for the people who had forgotten her, and for the nation that needed to remember its own wounds. The candle flame trembled again, stretching itself thin before regaining strength, as though mirroring the delicate resurgence of her presence in the collective memory. A presence that flickered, faltered, and ultimately glowed quietly within the heart of a nation, learning, slowly and tenderly, to remember what it had once lost. The slow, tremulous breath in the dark lingered like a faint stirring of something too fragile to name, and from that subtle movement the next part of Princess Deokhye's story emerged. A meditation on the symbolic weight her life came to bear once the veil of obscurity had lifted, revealing a narrative intertwined not only with her own personal suffering, but with the deeper currents of Korea's collective memory. For as her story re-entered public consciousness, gradually settling into the fabric of the nation's understanding of itself, she began to embody meanings far larger than a single life could reasonably hold. Her sorrow, once private and unspoken, became woven into the broader tapestry of a people's longing, regret, resilience, and unresolved grieving. To many Koreans, discovering that the last princess had lived out her days in exile and illness stirred an unexpected emotional response, a mixture of tenderness and aching recognition. Her story mirrored, in quiet miniature, the story of a nation once torn apart by foreign domination, forced transitions, and cultural dislocation. Just as Korea had struggled to retain its identity under the pressure of occupation, Deokhye had struggled to preserve the faint flickers of her childhood self in a world where she was seen not as a young girl in need of protection, but as a symbolic pawn in a larger imperial design. The vulnerability she carried from childhood into adulthood resonated deeply with a nation that had also walked a path through deprivation, coercion, and loss. Her life became a kind of emotional mirror, reflecting the tender parts of the Korean historical psyche. Those parts shaped not by battles and treaties, but by quiet suffering, endurance, and the longing to be remembered. In this sense, she came to symbolize the cultural and spiritual wounds inflicted during the colonial era. Just as she was uprooted from her homeland, so too was Korea uprooted from its sovereignty. Just as her identity was reshaped under foreign pressure, so too was the nation's sense of self. And just as she endured the loss of her daughter, her last connection to hope, Korea endured the severing of its own unity during the division of North and South. Though these parallels were never formally articulated, they existed as emotional resonances that shaped how the public came to interpret her story. Her suffering was not merely personal. It embodied the intimate costs of historical turmoil, the kind of costs that rarely appear in official records but linger in the hearts of those who lived through such times. Yet her symbolic weight extended beyond the realm of national trauma. She also came to represent the fate of individuals whose lives are shaped by forces beyond their control. Her story raised unspoken questions about agency, dignity, and the human consequences of political power. What becomes of a person when their childhood, education, marriage, and motherhood are dictated by others? How does one live when their identity is pulled in multiple directions until its core begins to crack? These questions, though woven subtly into her story, resonated with people who recognized in her life a universal theme: the fragility of the human spirit when subjected to relentless external pressures. For this reason, her story appealed not only to those interested in royalty or history, but also to those drawn to narratives of human endurance. Her symbolic significance grew further through artistic portrayals, which, while not always historically precise, sought to capture the emotional truth of her life. Writers described her as a figure caught between light and shadow, a princess whose crown had been fashioned from sorrow rather than gold. Filmmakers depicted her wandering through foreign landscapes with a quiet dignity, her expression reflecting a constant longing for something, or someone, forever out of reach. Dramatists brought her to life on stage, portraying her inner world through monologues filled with yearning, confusion, and occasional sparks of defiance. Though these interpretations varied in accuracy, they shared a common element. They portrayed her not as a passive victim, but as a person whose suffering carried meaning, whose endurance held a quiet, understated nobility. But the symbolic weight of her story also contained complexities. Some critics argued that the renewed interest in her life risked romanticizing her suffering, turning her tragedy into an aesthetic narrative that overshadowed the harsh realities of mental illness, colonial trauma, and familial rupture. Others worried that framing her purely as a symbol ignored the profound individuality of her life, the fact that she had lived, breathed, and felt in ways that extended beyond her usefulness as an emblem of collective sorrow. They urged readers and audiences to see her not merely as a representation, but as a human being whose suffering was real, whose emotions were complex, and whose story deserved respect rather than sentimentality. Yet perhaps the most delicate layer of her symbolic presence lies in the realm of memory and forgetting. Her life raises questions about who is remembered and who is allowed to fade from history. Why was she forgotten for so long? What does it mean for a nation to reclaim a figure it once overlooked? And how does the act of remembering reshape the story of both the individual and the society that recalls her? In remembering Princess Deokhye, Koreans were not simply recovering a lost royal. They were engaging in a subtle act of cultural healing, acknowledging a wound that had lingered at the edge of national consciousness. Her story encouraged people to look beyond the grand narratives of political triumphs and defeats, and to pay attention to the quiet, easily overlooked lives that bear the weight of historical transitions. Her symbolic presence also extended into conversations about women's lives during her era. As interest in her story grew, scholars and readers alike began to examine the constraints placed upon women of her status. Constraints that dictated whom they married, how they behaved, what choices they could make, and how their value was measured. Deokye's life became a poignant example of how gender, status, and political circumstance intersect to shape, and sometimes break, the lives of women. In this context, her story became an invitation to reflect on the countless women of her generation who endured their own quiet tragedies, their voices muted by societal expectations and historical silences. Furthermore, her story stirred conversations about the ethical responsibilities of nations toward individuals whose lives are shaped by public history. After all, Princess Deokhye had not merely been a victim of circumstance. She had been a victim of national upheaval, political manipulation, and a system that viewed her primarily as a symbol. In reclaiming her, Korea was compelled to confront the uncomfortable question of how societies ought to treat those who bear the cultural and historical burdens of their lineage. Through all these explorations, the symbolic weight of her story grew, not in the grandiosity of triumph, but in the quiet recognition that her life, fragile and sorrowful as it was, illuminated truths too often overlooked. She became a reminder that history is not only written in policies, battles, and treaties, but also in the fragile hearts of individuals caught within those forces. And as the tremulous breath in the darkness finally steadied, it carried with it the realization that Princess Deokye's story, though shaped by tragedy, offered an enduring lesson about compassion, both for the past and for the quiet, unseen lives that continue to unfold beyond the edges of recorded history. The question that had begun to form, but never quite took shape, seemed to hover in the air like a soft, unfinished breath. And from that quiet, lingering uncertainty, the next part of Princess Deokye's story unfolded, an exploration of how her life has been interpreted, misinterpreted, reshaped, and sometimes gently distorted by the hands of history. For when a life is marked by sorrow as profound as hers, and when it spans the upheavals of an entire century, it becomes almost inevitable that myths, assumptions, and narrative embellishments will cling to it like fine threads of mist, blurring the line between lived truth and imagined possibility. The truth of Princess Deokye's life, what she felt, what she understood, what she endured, remains suspended between documented fact and the hazy contours of recollection. She left behind no extensive writings that could serve as a direct window into her inner world. There was no diary in which she poured her fears or hopes, no letters that capture her private thoughts with unfiltered honesty. Much of what we know comes from those who observed her, each one bringing their own perspective, limitations, and interpretations. And so, from the earliest accounts of her childhood to the more contemporary retellings in novels and films, her story has unfolded through layers of human perception rather than through her own voice. One of the most persistent interpretations of her life casts her as a symbol of pure innocence, a delicate blossom crushed beneath the weight of imperial ambition and personal tragedy. In this view, she becomes almost an emblem of unblemished sorrow, a figure whose suffering evokes a kind of sacred sympathy. This interpretation, while rooted in compassion, risks simplifying her into a passive victim, a silent canvas upon which the struggles of her nation and the cruelty of her circumstances are projected. It overlooks the complexity of her personhood, the subtle strength she carried, and the quiet resilience that allowed her to endure for decades despite the relentless pressures upon her. Another interpretation casts her story as a grand allegory of Korean history itself, using the arc of her life to symbolize the nation's trajectory, from sovereignty to colonization, from fragmentation to recovery. In this reading, her early life represents the waning days of Joseon. Her forced exile mirrors the nation's cultural displacement. Her mental collapse reflects the spiritual devastation wrought by occupation, and her return to Korea symbolizes a form of national healing. This framework, though emotionally resonant, risks turning her into an abstraction. It transforms her into a metaphor rather than acknowledging her as a human being with her own distinct experiences, her own private pains that cannot be fully equated with historical events. There are also narratives that attempt to focus on her as a romantic figure, a princess trapped in an ill-fated love story, yearning for affection in the cold confines of an arranged marriage. These accounts, often influenced by modern tastes for drama and emotional intensity, lean into the imagery of star-crossed longing, yet they overlook the political realities that defined her union with Tsuneori. So, realities far more complex than unrequited affection or thwarted romance. Her marriage was arranged under the pressures of empire, her life molded by decisions made in diplomatic rooms rather than by the whispers of the heart. While it is possible she longed for companionship or tenderness, the narratives that cast her as a tragic heroine, seeking love, risk, imposing modern sensibilities onto a life where emotional expression was constrained not only by circumstance, but by the strictures of her own upbringing. Still other interpretations attempt to portray her as fragile, to the point of fragility being her defining trait, a porcelain figure shattered by a single blow. Yet mental collapse rarely arises from one event alone, and Deokye's life contained a series of losses, dislocations, and pressures that accumulated over decades. To reduce her breakdown to a simple causal chain, be it the loss of her daughter, the strain of exile, or the weight of her symbolic status, is to overlook the layered nature of human vulnerability. Her story reminds us that sorrow cannot always be traced neatly, that emotional unraveling often arises from a web of interconnected wounds. Conversely, there are interpretations that cast doubt on some aspects of her tragedy, questioning the existing records, the reliability of testimonies, and the accuracy of dramatized accounts. Was her marriage truly devoid of warmth? Was her daughter's disappearance fully understood? Or have historical narratives been shaped by assumptions? Did she cling to certain memories more than others? Some historians argue that certain details, especially those surrounding Masai, have been colored by later narratives seeking to emphasize dramatic impact rather than sticking to the uncertain facts. The truth, they suggest, may be less theatrical, but no less sorrowful. This leads to one of the most difficult aspects of interpreting her life, the question of what cannot be known. The gaps in her story are not simply voids to be filled with imagination. They are reminders of the limitations inherent in reconstructing any human life, especially one lived under such constrained circumstances. There are moments that no record can capture. The texture of her breath on a quiet evening in Naxion Hall, the exact shape of her longing as she wandered her childhood palace after returning home, the interior silence that settled within her when the world became too heavy to hold. These intimate truths remain hers alone, preserved behind the veil of a mind fractured by sorrow and time. Yet perhaps the most enduring misinterpretation is the temptation to view her life solely through the lens of tragedy. While it is undeniable that she endured immense suffering, reducing her entire existence to a single emotional tone risks flattening her humanity. There were moments of joy, fleeting yet real, in her childhood. Games played beneath the palace eaves, stories told by court ladies, the warmth of her father's affection. There were moments of tenderness in her motherhood, when she held Masai close and felt, for a brief period, that her world contained a light bright enough to soften the edges of exile. And there were moments of calm in her final years, when she walked through the palace gardens and let the wind brush gently against her face. These moments do not negate her suffering, but they complicate her story, reminding us that even the most sorrow-filled lives contain glimmers of beauty. Interpreting Princess Deokye's life requires navigating this delicate balance between fact and feeling, between the historical record and the emotional truths carried within it. Her story invites empathy, but it also demands a careful respect for what cannot be known. It encourages us to look beyond the simplified narratives that often accompany royal biographies and to recognize the quiet courage embedded in her endurance. And so the question that had hovered unspoken settles softly into the air. Perhaps it is not our task to resolve her story into a single coherent meaning. Perhaps the unanswered questions about her daughter, her inner world, her unspoken thoughts are themselves a form of truth, reminding us that some lives are not meant to be fully understood, but gently witnessed. The silence that follows is neither empty nor dismissive. It is an acknowledgement that mystery, too, has its place, that in the quiet spaces left by what cannot be known, her humanity lingers most clearly. The soft, unspoken question that had drifted into the air at the end of the previous reflection seemed to hover still, like a faint shimmer in the dimness before dawn. And from that lingering uncertainty, the final part of Princess Deokhye's story unfolded. A closing meditation not on answers, but on the quiet human truth that remained after everything else had fallen away. For in the end, what remains of a life such as hers cannot be measured solely in sorrow, nor solely in symbolism, nor solely in the fractured recollections preserved by others. What endures is something far gentler, far more nuanced than any grand narrative. The quiet memory of a woman who lived, who suffered, who endured, and who, despite the immense pressures that shaped her existence, carried within her a softness that time could not entirely erase. As the years recede, Princess Deokhye's story feels less like a tragic epic and more like a fragile thread woven through the changing fabric of Korea's history. Her early life belonged to another world, a world of courtyards bathed in the filtered light of a waning dynasty, of hushed rituals performed beneath the watchful gaze of ancestors, of childhood laughter echoing through palace halls, unaware that the foundations beneath them were shifting irreversibly. Her later life drifted across distant seas, shaped by exile, foreign customs, and the heavy silence of a society that saw her more as a symbol than as a person. And in the final act of her journey, she returned to the place where her story began, not as the last princess of a royal line, nor as a forgotten patient from a distant hospital, but simply as a woman nearing the end of her days, seeking rest in the quiet, familiar spaces of her childhood palace. It is tempting to think of her life as defined entirely by what was taken from her homeland, her choices, her child, her health. Yet doing so overlooks the delicate resilience that persisted through every loss. Even in the depths of her sorrow, she carried with her a certain tenderness, expressed in small gestures that surface throughout her life. The way she held her daughter close in the soft evenings of their early years together, the way she touched the bark of trees after her return to Korea, as though greeting old companions, the way she murmured faint melodies remembered from long ago, allowing music to bridge the distance between past and present. These moments, though quiet, reveal a truth often overshadowed by the magnitude of her tragedy, that she did not surrender entirely to the darkness that encircled her. There remained within her a small, persistent light, a light not of triumph, but of endurance. History often remembers the dramatic, the powerful, the decisive. It is drawn to victories, defeats, revolutions, and bold proclamations. Yet lives like Princess Deokhye's remind us that history is also shaped by the quiet, the fragile, the overlooked. Her existence did not alter the course of nations, did not command armies or negotiate treaties. Instead, her story reveals the deeply human cost of political transformation, the way individuals are swept along by currents they did not choose, the way personal lives fracture under the weight of national upheaval, the way even the most privileged can become vulnerable when the structures around them collapse. Through her story, we glimpse the countless unnamed others whose lives were similarly shaped by forces beyond their control during that turbulent period. As Korea modernized and redefined itself, Princess Deokye's life slowly slipped back into public awareness, inspiring not only sorrow but reflection. Writers and historians saw in her story an opportunity to reconsider the narratives that had shaped the nation's understanding of its past. Artists found in her a subject whose quiet suffering spoke to universal themes of displacement, identity, and longing. And everyday people, learning of her life for the first time, felt a gentle ache, an ache that came not from nationalistic pride nor from sentimentality, but from a recognition of shared humanity. Her story, simple in its structure, yet profound in its emotional depth, reminded many that behind every historical moment lies a constellation of personal experiences, each carrying its own weight. In her final years at Naxeon Hall, she lived not as a symbol restored to grandeur, but as a quiet presence in a palace that had once been the center of a kingdom. Attendants guided her steps, relatives visited with soft voices, and the rhythms of the palace grounds became the rhythms of her own days. The sound of the wind in the pines, the murmur of water in the garden ponds, the distant calls of magpies, all became part of the gentle tapestry that held her together during her final decades. Even in her illness, there were moments when she seemed to reconnect with the world around her, moments when a glimmer of recognition would light her eyes as she touched a familiar doorway or glanced at an old stone pathway. It was as though fragments of her past floated intermittently to the surface, offering her brief windows of clarity within the quiet fog that now shaped her mind. When she passed away in 1989, her death was marked by a subdued solemnity. There were no elaborate ceremonies, no royal processions, no grand proclamations. Instead, her passing was noted with a gentle reverence, as though the nation, having rediscovered her story, understood that the greatest honor it could offer was a quiet farewell. Her funeral was small, attended by family and those who had cared for her in her final years. She was laid to rest not as a princess returning to her throne, but as a woman returning home, a daughter of Korea finding peace at last in the soil that had shaped her beginnings. In the years following her death, interest in her life grew steadily. Books, films, and articles brought her story to new generations, each retelling shaped by its own perspective, yet united by a shared desire to honor her. Through these works, her memory softened from the sharp outline of tragedy into something more contemplative, more humane. She became a figure not of pity, but of reflection. Someone whose life invited audiences to consider the fragility of identity, the cost of history, and the quiet strength required to endure what cannot be changed. And so, as we close this long journey through Princess Deokye's life, the final image that lingers is not one of sorrow, but of quiet, dawn-lit serenity. Imagine her walking slowly through the palace garden in the early morning, the sun rising gently over the tiled roofs, the dew shimmering on the grass. She steps lightly, neither princess nor exile, simply a woman carried by the soft rhythm of her own breath. The wind brushes her sleeve, a distant bird calls. In this moment, free from titles, free from expectations, free from the weight of her past, she exists only as herself. Perhaps that is the truest remembrance we can offer. Not the princess shaped by history, not the tragic figure shaped by suffering, but the human being who lived a deeply human life, marked by quiet endurance, fleeting joys, profound sorrow, and in the end, a gentle return to the place where she had first belonged.